3rd London General Hospital, Wandsworth Common, 14 October 1915. Dearest Elsie, the ink runs thin today, watered until it resembles weak tea rather than blood, which suits the trembling in my fingers well enough. The vibration travels up the nib, smudging the loops of my G's so they look less like letters and more like open wounds. I blame the damp. It has settled into the ward, a heavy, clinging thing that soaks the wool blankets and refuses to lift even when the radiators hiss their steam against the chill. I write from the edge of my cot, knees drawn up, balancing this sheet upon a hardcover copy of the Pickwick Papers left behind by a soldier who departed in August. Do not tell Mother about the shivers. Tell her only that the frost on the windowpanes grows thicker this year, creeping down the glass in white ferns that obscure the grey London sky. Tell her the cold has found its way inside the house, settling into the joints of the furniture and the bones of us all, demanding extra coal and thicker socks. That remains our code, does it not? If the frost is thick, I am warm enough while the world freezes. If the frost turns to ice, you must bring the heavy woolen scarf I left by our door in Bethnal Green, the one with the hole in the hem. It is merely brisk here, that is all you must write. Around me the ward hums with its own peculiar winter. We have converted the gymnasium into a place of rest, or so the matron claims, though the floorboards still bear faint scuff marks from basketball lines, ghostly arcs tracing beneath the rows of iron beds. It feels less like a hospital and more like an antechamber to the jolly elf's workshop. Do you recall the tales we spun when Father lost his post at the docks? How the elf required helpers to sort the stars before hanging them across the firmament. That is our task now, sorting, polishing, waiting for the shift to end so we might return to the fire. 2 beds down, a lad from the Royal Fusiliers has his leg attended to. The surgeon works with quick, efficient grace, the hands of a man who has performed this same motion 1,000 times since August. No anesthetic remains for minor procedures, or perhaps the shock has numbed the boy more effectively than any ether could. I dare not look directly at the sore. Instead, I watch dust motes dancing in the shaft of light cutting through the high window, imagining them to be frozen stars the elf dropped while rushing gifts to France. They drift downward, settling on the linoleum, on blood-stained lint, on the toes of my boots. Penhaligon. The voice barks, sharp and sudden. I jump, the nib scratching a jagged scar across the page. Nurse Cavell stands at my bedside, her cap starched into rigid wings, framing a face carved from granite. She presses a clipboard against her chest like a shield. Post departs in 20 minutes, she says, eyes flicking to the paper on me knee. Have you finished your correspondence? The censor is in a foul humor. He caught a boy in bed 4 attempting to slip a letter past without the stamp. Almost done, sister, I reply, covering the page with my hand. The paper feels flimsy, an inadequate barrier against the scrutiny of the state. See that it is, she mutters, moving on. No mentions of location, no names off units, and for God's sake, no mention of mud. If I see one reference to mud, I shall burn it myself to save the censor trouble. Her shoes squeak on the polished floor as she marches away. I wait until she turns the corner before resuming. Mud, as if we could speak of anything else. The mud is in me lungs, Elsie. It coats the back of my throat with every breath, a gritty sediment tasting of copper and rot. Yet I will not write it. I shall write instead of the elf's workshop being particularly busy, of stars requiring extra polishing before Essie can be hung in the firmament. How fares Woolwich? I imagine you standing at your bench, machinery vibrating through the soles of your feet. Tell Meth Lion King is well. Does he purr loudly these days? Does his roar shake the teacups on scullery shelf? You must tell Mother the noise is merely the king stretching his legs, exercising his voice before Eth Hunt. She worries when windows rattle, believing it the wind or perhaps trains on the line, but you and I know it is the king demanding his tithe. My fingers are stained yellow, not from ink, but from handling the shells they send us to clean before filling, or so I imagine your work. Here the stains differ. Carbolic acid leaves a white burn up on the skin, a bleaching that makes flesh appear dead before the rest of the body catches up. I scrub them raw each evening, yet the smell lingers. It clings Tommy cuticles, a sharp, medicinal tang no amount of soap can erase. I tried explaining the smell-toth man in the next bed, the one with bandaged head. He merely stared with his one good eye, whispering something about snow. He believes it snows inside the ward. Perhaps he is correct. Perhaps the elf has opened a window, letting the blizzard in to cool the fevered brows of his workers. Thomas, the boy from the Fusiliers, the one missing his leg. He lies pale, his face the color of wet ash, yet awake. His eyes are wide, fixed up on the ceiling where plaster peels in long, dry strips. Yes, Arthur, I keep me voice low. The matron dislikes conversation after lights out, even if it is only 4 in the afternoon. Did you post yours yet? He asks. His voice is thin, reedy, a flute played by a child who has not learned how to blow properly. Not yet, waiting for the ink to dry. He took mine, Arthur whispers. He turns his head up on the pillow, the movement costing him visible effort. The censor. He said I mentioned the trenches. I only wrote that the mud was deep. Deep enough to drown a horse, I wrote. Then you wrote the truth, I say, keeping my voice flat. And the truth is contraband. Arthur turns his face back to the ceiling. The plaster above him cracks further, a thin line extending towards the light fixture like a vein seeking blood. He does not speak again. There is nothing left to say that the censor would allow. I dip my nib once more, the ink pot nearly dry, the liquid thick and sluggish as it clings to the steel point. My hand trembles just slightly, a vibration that starts in the wrist and settles in the knuckles. I press harder. The paper fibers drink the black fluid, swallowing the words before they can be seen by anyone but Elsie. The frost is thick on the window, I write, thicker than last year. That is the signal. If she reads it, she will know the infection in my thigh has spread, that the fever comes and goes like a tide I cannot swim against. She will know I am not warm, that the workshop is cold. I blot the page with sand from the shaker on the bedside table, the grains scratching against the damp ink, absorbing the excess until the surface is dull. Folding the paper requires precision. Creases must be sharp, edges aligned, lest the envelope bulge and invite suspicion. A thick letter suggests secrets. A flat letter suggests news of the weather. Nurse Cavell returns before I can seal it. She does not ask. She holds out her hand, palm up, waiting for the tribute. I place the envelope in her grip. Her skin is cool, dry, smelling of soap and something metallic, perhaps the scissors she keeps tucked in her belt. She weighs the letter, testing its density, her eyes scanning my face for any flicker of defiance. I offer none. My expression is smooth, a mask of convalescent boredom. Post goes at 5, she says. Don't write again until tomorrow. Saves paper. She moves to the next bed. Arthur watches her, his one good eye tracking the starched wings of her cap until she disappears behind the partition screen. I lean back against the pillow, the mattress stuffing lumpy beneath my spine. The ward smells of boiled cabbage and carbolic acid, a scent that coats the tongue and refuses to wash away. Outside, London grays over, the light failing as clouds roll in from the east. I close my eyes and picture Bethnal Green. I picture the hearth rug, the one with the frayed edge near the fireguard. I wonder if it has frayed further today. I wonder if the myth costs us something real, something tangible, every time we lie to keep them safe. Woolwich Arsenal, 14th December, 1915. Dear Thomas, the roar begins at 6 and does not stop until the whistle blows at 6 again. It is not a sound one hears with ears alone. It enters through the soles of the boots, travels up the shin bone, and settles in the chest cavity where it vibrates against the ribs. Mother writes that the windows in the scullery rattle when the wind blows from the river, but you and I know the wind has nothing to do with it. It is the Lion King. He is awake in his den beneath the earth, stretching his legs, testing the strength of his voice before the hunt begins in earnest. I tell her he is purring. I tell her the king is merely content, stretching out after a long sleep. She nods, smoothing her apron, believing that a contented king means peace for us all. She does not see the shells. She does not see the cordite dust that settles on every surface like grey snow, finding its way into the pores of the skin, under the fingernails, into the lines of the palms. My hands are yellow, Thomas, not the yellow of a lemon or a daffodil, but the yellow of old parchment, of skin that has soaked up too much chemical sun. The foreman says it is the TNT, that it stains the blood itself. He calls us the Canary girls, laughing as he says it, as if we are birds in a cage singing for his amusement. I do not sing, I fill the shells. I pack the explosive into the casing with a wooden rammer, tap, 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 until the density is correct. One mistake, one spark from a metal tool striking the casing, and the workshop becomes a crater. We know this, we work anyway. Today a girl named Sarah dropped a casing. It clattered on the iron floor, a sound like a bell tolling for mass. Everyone froze. The machinery did not stopper. The Lion King does not stop for drop toiser, but the women around us went still, holding their breath, waiting for the flash. Sarah picked it up. Her hands shook so violently the casing rattled in her grip. I took it from her. I placed it in the bin. I told her to breathe. "Breathe, Sarah," I said. "The king is asleep." She looked at me, her eyes wide, the whites stark against the grease on her face. "He's not asleep," she whispered. "He's hungry." She is right, of course. He is always hungry. But I cannot write that to Mother. I cannot write that the factory floor is slick with oil and sweat, that the air is so thick with powder smoke it tastes of sulfur and rotten eggs. I write instead of the pantry. I tell Mother we are filling tins for the lion's winter store, preserving meats and grains to see him through the cold months. She reads this by the fire, I imagine, sipping her tea from the chipped cup, the one with the handle that feels loose when you twist it. Does the handle twist further, Thomas? I dreamed last night that the cup shattered in her hand, that the tea poured out like blood onto the hearth rug. I woke with the taste of cordite in my mouth, the sheets damp with sweat. It is a foolish dream. Cups do not break because of letters. Words do not change the physics of clay and fire. And yet, when I arrived home this evening, I looked at the rug. The fringe near the fireguard seems shorter than I remember. A few threads missing, burnt away perhaps by a stray ember. I said nothing, I merely stepped over it. I must insert the code now, before the censor reads this. He sits in an office somewhere in Whitehall, I suppose, a man with a red pencil and a heart full of rules. He looks for locations, for numbers, for names of regiments. He does not look for weather. He does not know that frost is a measure of pain. The frost is thick on the window, I write, dipping my pen into the pot. The ink is cheaper than yours, watery and pale, thicker than last year. There you will know that the noise is wearing me down, that the yellow is spreading up my wrists, that I am tired in a way sleep cannot fix. You will know to keep the workshop warm, to keep the elf busy with stars, so he does not look too closely at the men who are not returning from the polishing room. I seal the envelope with wax, pressing my thumb into the soft red pool to leave a mark. No crest, no insignia, just the whirl of my own skin. It is enough. I place it in my bag alongside the others, the stack growing thin as the weeks pass. Post goes at 5. If I run, I can catch the collection before the box is locked. I pull on my coat, the wool scratchy against my neck, and step out into the street. The air outside is cold, sharp with the smell of coal smoke and wet pavement. A bus rumbles past, the engine coughing black smoke into the twilight. I walk faster, my boots striking the ground in rhythm with the memory of the factory press. Tap, tap, tap. The post box stands on the corner, a pillar of red paint peeling to reveal the iron beneath. I lift the lid. It hinges open with a groan. Inside, the darkness waits, a mouth ready to swallow the words. I drop the letter. It flutters down, joining the others in the sack below. For a second I hesitate, my hand hovering over the slot. What if the censor sees the code? What if he knows that frost means fever, that ice means death? He would burn it. He would leave the space blank, and Mother would wonder why Elsie had nothing to say this week. She would worry. She would look at the rug. She would see the frayed edges and know. I let the lid fall. It clangs shut, the sound final echoing off the brickwork of the arsenal wall. I turn away, pulling my collar up against the wind. The Lion King roars in the distance, a low, vibrating thrum that I feel in my teeth, in my bones, in the hollow of my chest. I walk home through the gathering dark, counting the cracks in the pavement, trying not to think about the cup, or the rug, or the boy in the bed next to yours who lost his leg. The post will take 3 days. 3 days for the truth to travel 5 miles. 3 days for the frost to melt or freeze over completely. The ward smells of boiled cabbage and something sweetly rotten, like fruit left too long in a damp cellar. I sit on the edge of my cot, the iron frame biting into my thighs through the thin wool of my trousers. My leg throbs, a dull, rhythmic ache that matches the ticking of the clock on the far wall, each second a small hammer striking bone. Beside me, the orderlies move with an efficiency that borders on cruelty, stripping beds, folding sheets, dragging the heavy rubber mats that smell of carbolic acid and old blood. They do not speak. Speaking takes breath, and breath is rationed here, measured out in shallow sips to avoid drawing attention to the lungs that still work. I have my paper on my knee, a single sheet of foolscap salvaged from the chaplain's dwindling stock. The inkwell is nearly dry, the liquid thick and sludgy, requiring a vigorous stir of the nib to coax out a line. I dip the pen. It scratches against the fiber, leaving a trail of grayish-black that looks more like ash than writing. Dearest Elsie, I begin, the letters forming slowly, carefully, as if the paper might tear under the pressure of too much truth. The man in the bed next to mine, a boy from Leeds whose name I have forgotten but whose face is etched with the map of Flanders, is having his dressing changed. The nurse pulls back the gauze. The smell hits me first, a cloying sweetness that sits heavy on the tongue, masking the underlying stench of gangrene. She does not flinch. She dips a pair of forceps into a bowl of yellow antiseptic and begins to prod at the wound, scraping away the dead flesh with a metallic scrape that sets my own teeth on edge. The boy does not cry out. He stares at the ceiling, his eyes fixed on a crack in the plaster that runs like a lightning bolt across the white paint. He is counting the cracks, perhaps, or maybe he is somewhere else entirely, in a field of green grass where the air does not taste of death. I cannot write about the smell. I cannot write about the boy's leg, which ends abruptly below the knee, the stump wrapped in layers of blood-stained lint. Mother would see the words and know. She would know that the hospital is not a place of healing, but a sorting house, a way station between the mud and the grave. So I write of the workshop. The elf has been busy, I tell her, shaping the lie with the same care the nurse uses on the boy's stump. He has set up his bench at the end of the ward, polishing the stars until they shine like new shillings. The light from his lantern is soft, a gentle glow that keeps the shadows at bay. It is a poor metaphor, clumsy and strained, but it is all I have. The elf represents the peace we pretend exists, the fragile truce between life and the inevitable end. If I speak of the mud, the censor will take the letter. If I speak of the blood, the censor will burn it. But the elf is safe. The elf is a story for children, a fantasy that adults can tolerate because it costs them nothing to believe. I pause, lifting the pen from the paper. My hand trembles, a fine vibration that runs from my wrist to my fingertips, making the ink blob on the nib swell and threaten to drop. I wipe it on the edge of the tray, leaving a smudge that looks like a bruise. Across the ward, a door slams. The sound echoes, sharp and sudden, causing 3 men to flinch in unison, their bodies reacting before their minds can process the noise. It is only the kitchen staff, bringing in the supper trolleys, but to us, it is the crack of a rifle, the whistle of a shell. We are all waiting for the next explosion, even here, even in the safety of London. The frost is thick on the window. I write, the words flowing faster now, driven by a sudden urgency, thicker than last year. There the code is planted. Elsie will understand. She will know that the pain in my leg is worse, that the fever comes and goes like a tide, pulling me under before spitting me back onto the shore. She will know that I am tired, not just in my body but in my soul, weary of the pretending, of the masking, of the endless, exhausting effort of being brave for parents who deserve better than sons who break. I fold the paper, creasing the edges sharply to make it fit the envelope. The paper is thin, translucent enough to see the shadow of my handwriting through to the other side. I lick the flap, the taste of glue bitter and chemical on my tongue, and seal it shut. Outside, the sky is turning a bruised purple, the light fading rapidly as the autumn evening draws in. The lamps are not yet lit, leaving the ward in a semi-darkness that makes the shapes of the beds look like tombstones in a graveyard. A nurse walks past, her uniform stiff and starched, carrying a basket of letters collected from the other patients. She stops at the bed of the boy from Leeds. He holds out an envelope, his hand shaking slightly. She takes it, glances at the address, then frowns. She pulls a small pair of scissors from her pocket and snips the corner of the envelope open. Her eyes scan the page quickly, moving down the lines with practiced speed. "Can't send this, love," she says, her voice flat, devoid of sympathy. "Mention of mud. Regulations. The boy stares at her, but it's just, I said the boots were muddy. Regulations, she repeats, tearing the letter in half. The sound is loud, a ripping tear that cuts through the quiet of the ward. She drops the pieces into her basket on top of the other confiscated confessions. Write again, keep it cheerful, no talk of the front. She moves on to the next bed, leaving the boy staring at his empty hands. He does not cry. He simply turns over onto his side, facing the wall, pulling the blanket up over his head. I watch her approach my bed. My heart hammers against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She stops, looking down at me. I hold out my letter, keeping my face blank, my expression neutral. She takes it, weighing it in her hand as if checking for hidden contraband. Her eyes flick to the address, then to the seal. She runs a finger over the wax, feeling the impression of my thumb. "Frost, is it?" she asks, her tone unreadable. "Yes, sister," I say, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "Just the weather." She holds my gaze for a moment, her eyes dark and tired, seeing far more than I want her to. Then she nods once and places my letter in her basket, on top of the torn pieces of the boy's failed attempt. "Post goes at 5, she says. "Don't miss it." She walks away, the basket swinging at her hip, a collection of silenced voices and edited truths. I watch her go, waiting until she disappears through the double doors before I let out the breath I had been holding. The ward settles back into its uneasy quiet, the ticking of the clock resuming its dominance, marking the seconds until the next dressing change, the next meal, the next lie. I lean back against the pillow, the iron frame creaking under my weight. The boy from Leeds is still facing the wall, a lump under the blanket that does not move. I close my eyes, listening to the distant rumble of traffic outside, the sound of a city that continues to spin while we rot in our beds. The elf is busy, I tell myself. The stars are being polished. The workshop is warm. But the frost is thick, and it is getting thicker. The candles sputtered, a tiny dying star fighting the heavy dark of the scullery. Outside, the silence was not empty but waiting, a held breath that pressed against the thin glass of the windowpane. I dipped the nib again, the ink well nearly dry, the liquid thick and sluggish in the cold air. My fingers were stiff, the skin cracked from the cordite dust that worked its way into every crevice of the factory, turning my nails a permanent, sickly yellow that no amount of scrubbing could shift. "The Lion King dropped a heavy toy last night," I wrote, the script looping tight to save space on the scarce paper. It landed 3 streets over, shaking the cups right off the dresser. A lie, the cups had not fallen. They had shattered when Mrs. Gabler's wall blew out, sending brickwork and plaster across her kitchen table where her husband had been sitting not 10 minutes prior. I could still see the shape of him in the dust, a dark outline where the body had been dragged away before the wardens blew their whistles. I did not write about the shape. I did not write about the smell of wet plaster and something sweeter, like burnt meat, that clung to the back of my throat even now, hours later. The workshop shook, but the elf secured the doors, I added, pressing hard enough to tear the fiber of the page. "He says the king is just practicing his aim." Practicing as if death were a game of darts played in a pub, something to be laughed off with a pint of bitter and a shrug. The candle flame dipped low, casting long, dancing shadows that made the peeling paint on the ceiling look like maps of countries I would never visit. My eyes burned. The shift had ended at 6, but the cleanup had taken until 8, sweeping up glass from the factory floor where the blast had blown out the northern windows. We had worked in the dark, feeling our way along the benches, filling shells by touch alone, the heavy brass casings cold and greasy under our palms. "You should get some rest, Els." Maggie stood in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the faint grey light filtering in from the street. She held a tin mug of tea, the steam rising in a thin, pale ribbon. Her face was smudged with soot, a dark streak across her cheekbone where she had wiped away sweat. "In a minute," I said, not looking up. The pen scratched against the paper, a harsh, grating sound in the quiet room. "Just finishing this bit for Tom. He wanna tea know the difference if you send it tomorrow. The post isna tea going anywhere until the all clear gives way to the morning run. He needs to know we re all right." "We are not all right," Maggie said, her voice flat and stripped of the gentle comfort she usually offered. She stepped into the room where floorboards creaked under her heavy boots. Mrs. Gable is gone, Els, while her boy digs through the rubble with his bare hands. I tell you that is not all right. I stopped writing. The nib hovered over the paper, a single drop of ink swelling at the tip, dark and heavy, before falling to stain the word elf. It bloomed there, a black flower swallowing the letters. If I tell him that, I said, my voice barely a whisper, he'll try to come home. He's on crutches, Mag. He can't walk 10 yards without sweating through his shirt. If he thinks we in danger. He thinks we're in danger anyway, for it's London and the sky is full of them. Maggie set the mug down on the table, the metal ringing against the wood. He's not a fool. He knows what a Zeppelin sounds like. He knows what I tell him. I scraped the pen across the stain, trying to cover it with more ink, but it only made the paper soggy, the fibers mushing together. He knows the Lion King is loud, but the elf is clever. The deal. Thoughter how we keep them both from going mad. Maggie sighed, a long, weary sound that seemed to come from the bottom of her chest. She leaned against the doorframe, crossing her arms. You are killing yourself over a metaphor, Elsie. Words don't stop bombs. They stop the worry, I snapped, fatigue sharpening my tongue as I explained how Mum and Dad sit by the fire waiting for news, certain that if I sent them the truth, they'd die of fright before a bomb ever hit this street. Tom knows that, which is why he writes the same thing back. The frost is thick, and the workshop is cold. It's a code, Mag, the only thing we have left that's ours. Maggie didn't argue. She just looked at me, her eyes tired and old in a face that shouldn't have known such weariness yet. She reached out, her rough hand covering mine, stopping the frantic scratching of the pen. Just finish it, she said softly, then come to bed. The next shift starts in 6 hours. She turned and left, her footsteps fading down the hall. I was alone again with the candle and the shadowed walls. The silence outside had broken, a police whistle wailed in the distance, a low, mournful cry that rose and fell like a grieving woman. The all clear? Not yet. Just a warning that the danger had passed for now, that the sky was clear of engines, but the threat remained, hanging in the air like smoke. I looked down at the letter. The ink stain had dried, a permanent blotch on the page. It looked like a wound. I folded the paper carefully, aligning the edges with precise, trembling fingers. I would not mention the glass in my pocket. I had found it an hour ago, reaching into my coat for a handkerchief and feeling the sharp bite of it against my thigh. A shard of window glass, jagged and green-tinged, no bigger than a fingernail. It had cut through the wool of my skirt and nicked the skin beneath, leaving a small, stinging line of blood that had crusted over. It was a piece of the Lioness roar, a physical fragment of the explosion that had killed Mrs. Gable. To send it would be to break the rules of the workshop, to bring the war inside the sanctuary of the myth. Thomas would know what it was. He would know I was lying about the toy. He would know the king had won this round. But I couldn't throw it away. I picked up the shard from the table where I had placed it. It caught the candlelight, refracting it into a tiny, sharp rainbow on the wood. I wrapped it in a separate scrap of paper, folding it tight over and over until it was a small, hard packet. I would put it in the envelope, not with the letter but tucked inside the fold, hidden against the lining. Let him feel the weight of it. Let him know that the frost was not just on the window, but in the room, in the pockets, in the blood. The candle guttered again, the flame shrinking to a blue pinpoint before flaring up one last time. I blew it out. The darkness rushed in, absolute and suffocating. I sat there in the black, the paper packet clutched in my hand, listening to the distant sound of a dog barking somewhere in the ruins of the next street. Tomorrow the post would go. Tomorrow the lie would travel to the hospital. And tomorrow the truth would travel with it, wrapped in paper, sharp enough to cut. The candle flame died, leaving a trail of sulfur that strung the nose more than the cordite dust clinging to my hair. Darkness pressed against the eyelids, heavy and wet. I sat still, listening. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked, frantic and high-pitched, tearing at the quiet until a voice shouted it into silence. The all clear had not sounded yet, only that mournful wail which meant the engines were gone, but the danger remained, hanging in the air like unspent smoke. My fingers found the envelope on the table, the paper rough under my thumb. I could not see the words I had written, but I knew where the ink had bled through, knew the shape of the lie regarding the Lion King's toy. It sat there in the black, a tangible thing. I reached into my coat pocket, the wool scratching my knuckles, and pulled out the small, hard packet wrapped in scrap paper. The glass inside shifted, a tiny rattle like dry seeds. To send it was to break the workshop. Thomas would feel the weight, the sharp edges pressing through the lining, and he would know the toy had shattered, know the neighbor was dead, know the frost on the window was actually soot. But to keep it felt like swallowing a stone. I slid the packet into the envelope, tucking it against the fold where the censor's knife might not slice. Let him cut his thumb on the truth. Let him bleed a little so he knows we are still here. The match struck, a sudden flare of orange that cast long, dancing shadows against the peeling wallpaper. I sealed the envelope with wax from a stub found in the drawer, pressing Mum's thimble into the soft red pool to make an impression. It looked lopsided, the metal rim sinking deep into the wax, but it would hold. The postman would come at dawn, trudging through the rubble and the wet ash, collecting the letters that promised safety while the city burned around us. I stood up, my knees cracking, the stiffness of the night shift settling into my bones. The floorboards were cold, the chill rising through the thin soles of my boots. I walked to the window, careful to stay back from the glass, and peered through the gap in the blackout curtains. The street below was a cratered mess, illuminated by the occasional flare of a rescue lantern. Men moved in the gloom, silhouettes passing buckets of water, their movements slow and deliberate. One of them stopped, looking up at my window, though he could not see me. He raised a hand, not in greeting, but in a weary acknowledgement of survival. We were all still here, for now. The ward at the 3rd London General smelled of carbolic acid and wet wool, a cloying sweetness that could not quite mask the underlying tang of gangrene. Thomas lay on his side, the sheet pulled up to his chin, his breath coming in short, shallow hitches. The fever had spiked again, turning the room into a swimming pool of grey light and distorted shapes. He tried to lift his right hand, the one that usually held the pen, but the fingers twitched uselessly, thick and clumsy as sausages. A shadow moved beside the bed, blocking the light from the corridor. "Try again, mate," the orderly said, his voice low and rough, like gravel shifting under a boot. "I've got the paper, just speak it. I'll write it down." Thomas swallowed, his throat dry as sandpaper. Not much to say, Arthur." "Bollocks," Arthur muttered, the pen scratching against the clipboard resting on his knee. "Your sister's waiting. She thinks you've forgotten her. Write something, even if it's just about the weather." "The weather's rubbish," Thomas croaked, a weak smile touching his lips. "Always raining, or mud, just mud." "Write mud." As Arthur's pen moved faster, he asked, "What else? How's the leg?" "Leg's fine." The lie came easily, slipping out before he could check it. The leg was on fire, the bandages soaked through with pus that smelled sweet and rotten. He could feel the heat radiating from it, a separate entity living beneath the sheets. Tell her the elf has locked the workshop doors early." Arthur paused, the nib hovering over the paper. "The what?" "The elf," Thomas repeated, his eyes drifting shut. The ceiling seemed to ripple, the plaster cracks forming the shape of a reindeer's antlers. He's tired. The frost got in, froze the tools. Can't make any more toys until the thaw." "Right," Arthur said slowly, skepticism threading through his tone as he added, "Frozen tools. Got it." "And the lion," Thomas whispered, the words tumbling out in a rush as he declared that the Lion King is roaring louder tonight, shaking the foundations. Yet the workshop is safe, locked tight so that no one gets in. "Safe," Arthur echoed, writing quickly now, trying to capture the delirium before it faded. "Locked tight. Anything else, Tom?" "Tell her," Thomas's voice trailed off, the fever pulling him under. "Tell her not to look in the pockets, not yet." "Pockets?" Arthur leaned closer, squinting in the dim light. "What pockets, mate?" But Thomas was already gone, his breathing deepening into the heavy rhythm of sleep, or perhaps something worse. The orderly sat there for a moment, listening to the wheeze in the man's chest, then shook his head and stood up. He tucked the letter into the pile on the bedside table, next to a half-empty glass of water and a tin of ointment. Outside, the rain began to fall again, tapping against the window pane like impatient fingers. The post would leave in the morning, carrying the fever dreams of a dying man to a sister who was counting on lies to keep her own world from collapsing. Arthur looked down at his hands, stained with ink and blood, and wondered how long the paper would hold the weight of such things before it tore. 3 days later, the letter arrived in Woolwich, tucked inside a pile of circulars and bills that Elsie sorted through at the kitchen table. The envelope was thin, the paper inside crinkled and stained with what looked like tea or perhaps something darker. She slit it open with a knife, her heart hammering against her ribs. The handwriting was not Thomas's. It was jagged, hurried, the loops of the letters uneven. She read the first line, then the second, her breath catching in her throat. The elf has locked the workshop doors. Her hands began to shake, the paper rustling loudly in the quiet room. Locked doors. In their code, that meant danger. That meant the workshop was compromised. Had he been hurt? Was he gone? She scanned the rest of the page, searching for a date, a clue, anything to anchor the words to reality. But there was nothing, just the mention of the lion roaring and the frost. She dropped the letter onto the table, it sliding across the wood until it hit the salt cellar. The silence in the kitchen was absolute, pressing against her ears. Then she remembered the packet she had sent. The glass, the sharp, jagged truth hidden in the fold. Had it arrived before his letter? Had he felt it and known the end had come? She reached for her coat, the one with the torn pocket, and plunged her hand inside. Empty. She had sent it away. She had sent the proof of the destruction to the one person who couldn't do anything about it. Sob rose in her chest, harsh and ugly, but she swallowed it down. Crying wouldn't bring him back. Crying wouldn't fix the locked doors. She picked up the letter again, smoothing the creases with trembling fingers. There had to be another way to read it, a code within the code. Locked doors early, not forever, just early. Maybe it meant he was resting. Maybe it meant the fever had taken him for a while, but he was still there. She clutched the paper to her chest, closing her eyes against the sting of tears. She would write back. She would tell him the frost was melting. She would lie until her tongue bled. But first she needed to know if the post from her had reached him. She looked at the calendar on the wall, the days crossed off in red ink. Tuesday, Thursday. The medical board met on Thursdays. If he was locked away, if he was too sick to write, someone else would have to send the news, someone like Arthur. She turned the envelope over, looking for a postmark, a stamp, anything that might tell her when it had been sent. The ink was smudged, the date illegible. It could have been written yesterday, or 3 days ago, or a week. Time had become a fluid thing, slipping through her fingers like water. She stood up, knocking the chair back with a screech of wood on linoleum. She had to go to the post office. She had to ask, but what would she say? Did my brother die while I was filling shells? They wouldn't tell her. Never did. She walked to the sink, turning on the tap. The water rushed out cold and clear, splashing against her wrists. She scrubbed her hands, trying to wash away the feeling of the paper, the smell of the hospital, the taste of the lie. But it wouldn't come off. It was under her skin now, part of her. She dried her hands on her apron, the rough fabric scratching her palms. Then she picked up the pen. She had work to do. The lion was roaring and the elf was sleeping. But the workshop. The workshop had to stay open, even if she had to build it herself, brick by lying brick. She dipped the pen in the inkwell, the black liquid swirling like a storm cloud. And she began to write, the words flowing fast and desperate, a dam breaking against the paper. The ink pooled at the edge of the nib, a black tear waiting to fall. She pressed down, forcing the liquid into the fiber, watching it spread like a bruise. Dear Tom, she wrote, the letters sloping upwards as her hand cramped. The frost is melting here. The sun came out this morning, though you know how Woolwich gets, all grey smoke and soot. A lie. The sky had been black with dust from the fallen brickwork since dawn. She dipped the pen again, the metal scratching against the paper, a dry rasping sound that filled the small kitchen. Elsie. The voice came from the hallway, thin and frayed. Her mother stood in the doorway, a shawl pulled tight around her shoulders despite the warmth of the room. The candlelight carved deep hollows into the older woman's face, highlighting the dust settled in the wrinkles around her eyes. She squinted at the table, at the scattered papers, the inkwell, the knife. You'll wake the neighbors, her mother said, her voice dropping to a whisper. The wardens are still out, they'll see the light. Elsie moved her arm, shielding the letter with her elbow. The paper crinkled under the fabric of her sleeve. It's covered, just finishing a note to Thomas. Thomas, her mother stepped closer, the floorboards creaking under her weight. She reached out, fingers hovering over the envelope, then pulled back as if the paper burned. He wrote, is he well? He's resting, Elsie said, the words tasting like copper. The workshop is quiet tonight, the elf is sleeping. Her mother nodded slowly, the motion stiff. She knew the code. They all did, though they pretended not to, pretending instead that it was a game for children, a fancy to keep the worry at bay. But the look in her eyes, the way her hands twisted the edge of her shawl, betrayed her. She knew what the sleeping elf meant. She knew what the locked doors signified. "Don't stay up too late," her mother said, turning away. The shawl brushed the doorframe, catching on a splinter of wood. She didn't notice. "We need you fresh for the shift. The foreman says the quotas are up again." "I'll be there," Elsie said. The door clicked shut. Elsie waited, counting the seconds until her mother's footsteps faded down the hall, the rhythmic thud of slippers on linoleum ceasing only when the bedroom door closed. Only then did she exhale, the air leaving her lungs in a long, shuddering rush. She looked down at the letter. "The workshop is quiet." It was a lie. The workshop was a charnel house, and the elf was dead, and the lion was eating the world. But she wrote it. She forced the pen to form the loops, the curves, the delicate fiction that kept her mother from screaming. She blotted the page, pressing the coarse paper against the wet ink until it was dry to the touch. Folding it required precision. The creases had to be sharp, the edges aligned. She slipped it into the envelope, sealing it with a lick of glue that tasted of starch and salt. Then she reached for the coat. It hung on the back of the chair, the heavy wool stiff with grime and the fine grey powder of the factory. She ran her hand over the pocket, the one she had checked before. Empty, she had been sure. But panic made a fool of a person. It made you blind to what was right in front of your face. She turned the coat inside out, the lining ripped and frayed where the shrapnel had caught it. There, lodged in the seam where the pocket met the body of the coat, was a sliver of glass. It was no larger than a fingernail, jagged and green, edged with the soot of the explosion. It had missed her skin by a fraction of an inch, hiding in the fold of the fabric while she tore the house apart looking for it. She picked it up, holding it between her thumb and forefinger. It caught the candlelight, fracturing the flame into a dozen tiny, dancing shards. This was the truth, not the lies about the elf, not the stories of the frost melting. This was the lion's roar made solid. To send it was to break the rule. The mythology demanded distance. It required the war to stay outside the wardrobe, translated into metaphor, softened into story. If she sent the glass, she was sending the wound itself. Thomas would hold it in his hand and feel the sharp edge of Woolwich. The reality of the raid that she had promised was just a heavy toy dropping. She looked at the envelope, addressed in her neatest hand. Then she looked at the glass. A transaction, that was what the workshop was, a trade of pain for peace. If she sent this, the cost would be paid. Something else would break. A cup, a plate, a memory, but he needed to know. He needed to feel the weight of what she was walking through, even if it shattered the illusion they had built to keep their parents sane. She tore a small square from the corner of a used circular, the paper rough and thin. She placed the glass in the center, folding the paper over it once, twice, until it was a small, hard packet. It prickled against her palm, dangerous even through the layers. She slipped it into the envelope with the letter, feeling it slide against the paper, a hard secret nestled among the soft lies. Outside, the all-clear bells began to clang, a low, mournful sound that vibrated in the window pane. The war was moving on, drifting east towards the city center, leaving Woolwich to pick up its bricks and bury its dead. Elsie sealed the envelope, pressing her thumb into the wax until it left a print. She stood up, her joints stiff, and walked to the door. The hallway was dark, the house holding its breath. She placed the letter on the mat, ready for the morning collection, a package of fiction and shrapnel bound for a hospital bed in London. She turned back to the kitchen, catching her reflection in the dark window. The face looking back was pale, the eyes shadowed, but the jaw was set. She walked to the table and blew out the candle. The smoke curled upwards, a grey ribbon dissolving into the darkness. In the drawer of the sideboard, the teacup with the chipped rim sat waiting. She could feel it there, fragile and brittle. Tomorrow, perhaps, it would fall. Tonight, the letter was sent. The workshop remained open, but the walls were thinning and the cold was getting in. She ran her hand over the table, feeling the grain of the wood, rough and real, beneath her fingers. Tomorrow she would write again. She would tell him the sun was shining. She would tell him everything was fine, and she would pray that the glass didn't cut him when he opened it. The trolley wheels squeaked against the linoleum, a high-pitched protest cutting through the low murmur of coughing. Thomas turned his head on the pillow. Dust motes danced in the shaft of afternoon light slicing the ward, swirling above the rows of white beds like smoke from a distant fire. He waited. The orderly moved down the aisle, handing out envelopes with the mechanical efficiency of a machine gunner loading a belt. Penhaligon. A single sheet, cream stock, Elsie's handwriting cramped in the top left corner. He took it, the paper felt warm, carried from the outside world into this sterile box of carbolic and boiled linen. He propped himself up on one elbow, the movement sending a sharp tug through the healing flesh of his thigh. Ignored it. He reached for the tin box on the bedside locker, lifting the lid to retrieve his fountain pen. The ink inside had skin forming on the surface. He pierced it with the nib. "Bad news," Arthur asked from the next bed. Arthur was missing a leg below the knee. He spent his days smoking hand-rolled cigarettes that smelled of sweet tobacco and burnt hair, watching the ceiling as if counting the cracks in the plaster. "No," Thomas said, "just wool." "Wool's good." Arthur struck a match against the bed frame. The flare illuminated his hollow cheeks for a second before he cupped his hand around the flame. "Better than mud." Thomas unfolded the letter. The first paragraph spoke of the weather in Bethnal Green, of the fog rolling off the river and settling in the lungs of the city. Standard, safe. He turned the page. The second paragraph began with "the shift was longer" and then stopped. A thick bar of black ink obliterated the next 4 lines. The censor's scissors had not cut the paper, but the pen had done the same work, drowning the words in a lake of opaque fluid. He traced the edge of the blot with his thumb, feeling the ink still slightly raised and tacky against the skin. Something had happened in Woolwich. Whether an accident, a fire, or perhaps a raid, the Ministry of Munitions did not black out talk of long shifts. They blacked out danger. They blacked out the sound of the Lion King roaring too close to the factory gates. Thomas looked at the blank space where the truth had been. If he wrote back asking what happened, the next letter would not come at all. The censor would hold it. The silence would grow teeth. He had to acknowledge the gap without naming it. He had to speak the code. He dipped the pen. The nib scratched against the paper, leaving a trail of blue-black fluid that smelled of iron and gall. "Dearest Elsie," he wrote, "I hope the fog lifts soon. It is hard to see the path when the air is so thick." He paused, too obvious. The censor read for metaphor too. They were not fools, merely bored men with red pens. He crossed out the line with a single sharp stroke, the ink bleeding into the fibers. He needed the workshop. He needed the elf. "The weather here is unchanged," he wrote instead. "Cold. But I heard a rumor from the orderly that the workshop gears might be jamming up north. You know how it is when the frost gets into the machinery. The elf will need to oil the cogs before anything snaps." He pressed harder on the downstroke. Oil the cogs. A warning, be careful, slow down, do not push the machine so hard it breaks. It was a clumsy substitution for stay away from the press or watch your fingers, but it was all he had. The mythology was a shield, but it was getting heavy. Every lie added weight to the armor until it was hard to move beneath it. Writing a novel, Arthur blew smoke towards the ceiling. The grey ribbon hung there, unmoving in the stagnant air. "Keeping the peace." Peace, a dry rattle shook Arthur's chest as he laughed, declaring that it was a new one since he hadn't heard that word since August. Thomas ignored him. He continued writing, describing the food in the hospital, the quality of the tea, the way the nurses moved like ghosts in their starched aprons. Lies mostly. The tea was watery and tasted of tin. The nurses were exhausted, their eyes ringed with dark circles that no amount of powder could hide. But Elsie did not need the truth of the ward. She needed to know he was alive. He signed his name at the bottom, the letters looping tight and controlled. He blotted the page, watching the coarse paper absorb the excess ink until it left a faint grey shadow on the reverse side. He folded the letter, aligning the edges with precise, deliberate movements. A crooked fold looked hurried, and anything hurried looked suspicious. Everything had to be calm, everything ordinary. He slipped the letter into an envelope, but did not seal it immediately, instead holding it up to the light to check its weight. It felt light, too light, for there was no glass inside this time. He wondered if the censor had found the shard Elsie had sent before. If they had said nothing. They simply took it, confiscating contraband like another piece of the world removed. "Sister's coming," Arthur said, tapping his cigarette ash into a jam jar before adding, "Round 3. Thomas looked down the ward. Sister Evans was walking towards them, her clipboard held against her chest like a shield. She wore a crisp white uniform that seemed to repel the grime of the hospital, a stark contrast to the grey wool of the patient's pajamas. She stopped at Thomas's bed. "Post going out, Penhaligon." "Yes, sister." "Give it here. The bag closes in 10 minutes. He handed over the envelope. She took it without looking at the address, sliding it into the leather satchel at her waist. The buckle clicked shut. The sound was final. The letter was gone, traveling back into the machine, into the hands of the censors, into the house in Bethnal Green where his parents would read it and wonder why their son was talking about elves while his country burned. "Any word on your board?" she asked. Her voice was flat, professional. She did not look at his leg. "Tuesday," Thomas said. "They said Tuesday." "Keep the dressing dry." She turned to Arthur. "Put that out, Mr. Gable. You know the rules." "It's medicinal," Arthur said. He took another drag before crushing the end against the metal rim of the jar. Sister Evans moved on. The wheels of her shoes squeaked on the floor, a rhythm that matched the ticking clock. Thomas watched her go. He felt a sudden hollowness in his stomach, a physical gap where the letter used to be. He had sent the code. He had warned her, but warnings did not stop shells. They did not stop gears from grinding. He lay back against the pillow. The starched case crackled against his neck. He closed his eyes and pictured the house in Bethnal Green. He tried to see the sideboard, the teacups arranged in a row. He wondered if they were still there. Sometimes, when he wrote about the frost, he felt a coldness in his own hands that lasted for hours. A transaction. He knew the rule, even if he did not speak it. To save them from the truth, something else had to pay. He opened his eyes as the light in the ward faded, shadows lengthening across the floorboards. Arthur was asleep, his mouth open, with the jam jar full of grey ash resting on the locker beside him. Thomas reached for his water jug, finding the glass cool to the touch. He took a sip. The water tasted of pipes and metal. He looked at his hand, steady despite the certainty that somewhere, miles away across the river, a cup had just fallen, or perhaps a plate, or maybe a picture frame slipping from its hook as the workshop took its due. He set the glass down, resolving to write again tomorrow and tell her the gears were turning smoothly, which would be a lie, just as he would keep the wardrobe locked. The orderly returned with the post bag, slinging it over his shoulder. The leather creaked. He walked towards the door, the heavy boots thudding against the floor. Thomas watched him leave. The bag swung at his hip, a collection of silenced voices and edited truths. He waited until the orderly disappeared through the double doors before he let out the breath he had been holding. The ward settled back into its uneasy quiet, the ticking of the clock resuming its dominance, marking the seconds until the next dressing change, the next meal, the next lie. Thomas turned onto his side, facing the wall. The plaster was cracked, a thin line running from the picture rail down to the skirting board. He traced it with his eyes. It looked like a river on a map, a river flowing nowhere. He closed his eyes again. He needed to sleep. He needed to dream of snow. He needed to forget the smell of the ink. 3 days later, the post arrived with the morning tea. Arthur sat up, wincing as his bandaged shoulder pulled against the starched sheet. He reached for the tray before the orderly could set it down, fingers trembling slightly around the chipped rim of the mug. "Anything for me?" "Nothing but bills and circulars," Thomas said. He held his own envelope up to the weak light filtering through the high ward windows. The paper was thick, cream-colored, but the address was written in Elsie's tight, slanting hand. Something was wrong with the surface. A dark stain bloomed across the center, obscuring the second paragraph entirely. Ink had pooled there, soaked through, and dried into a hard, black scab. "Open it then," Arthur said. He blew on his tea, the steam rising in a thin grey ribbon. "Don't hover, it's bad luck." Thomas tore the edge. He pulled out the sheet. The smell of home hit him first, a lavender water and coal dust, faint beneath the sharp tang of the hospital carbolic. He read the first few lines. "Dear Tom, the weather remains cold. Mother says the frost is thick on the pavement. Standard code, safe." Then he reached the blot. It covered the mention of the factory accident. He knew it without seeing the words. The censor's pen had drowned the truth in ink, a heavy-handed erasure that left the paper wrinkled and distorted. Elsie had tried to write around it, her handwriting spiking sharply where the nib had caught on the wet ridge. "They've taken it," Thomas said. His voice was flat. "Taken what?" "The news about the shift." Thomas traced the edge of the blot with his thumb. The paper felt rough, abraded. "She tried to tell me someone was hurt, maybe killed. Now it's just a shadow." "Better a shadow than a hole," Arthur said. He took a sip of tea, grimacing at the heat. "Right back. Tell her you got it." Thomas reached for his pen. He dipped the nib into the well. The ink was fresh, black and viscous. He touched it to the page, but his hand hovered. If he wrote, "I know about the accident," the censor would cut it out. If he wrote, "All is well," he lied to her face. He had to go deeper into the myth. He had to make the lie carry the weight of the truth. "The workshop gears have jammed," he wrote. "The elf says the ice is too thick in the cogs. He is clearing the frost." It was dense, opaque, yet Elsie would understand because the gears were the machinery and the ice was the blood. He pressed harder, the nib scratching against the fiber. Miles away, in Bethnal Green, Elsie stood at the sideboard. The morning light caught the dust motes dancing above the mahogany. She reached for the blue teacup, the one with the chip on the rim that caught her thumb every time she washed it. Her fingers closed on empty air. She blinked. She leaned closer, squinting at the polished wood. The space where the cup had sat for 10 years was bare, clean, no ring of dust, no mark of removal, just empty wood. "Maggie," she called. Her voice sounded thin in the quiet house. "Where's the blue cup?" Maggie came into the room, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at the sideboard, then at Elsie. Her face did not change, but her eyes tightened at the corners. "Which one?" "The chipped one, Mother's." "Didn't see it," Maggie said. She turned away, busying herself with the kettle. "Probably broke. Things break, Els, you know how it is." "I didn't hear it break." "Doesn't mean it didn't." As Maggie poured the water, the sound rushed loud and rushing into the pot. "Don't fuss, we've got plenty." Elsie touched the wood again. It was cold. She knew the rule, though she never spoke it. When they hid the pain, the house paid the price. A cup for a wound, a plate for a death. She pulled her hand back as if the wood burned. She sat at the table and picked up her pen. She had to tell Thomas, but she couldn't say the cup was gone. That would alarm Mother. "The elf must be rearranging the furniture," she wrote. "He says the workshop is too crowded. He has taken the blue vessel to make space for the new tools." She blew on the ink. It dried quickly, turning from gray to black. She folded the letter, sealing the lie inside. It was a transaction. She had bought Thomas's safety with a piece of her mother's history. She hoped it was enough. Back in the ward, Thomas stared at his own page. He had written about the gears, but he needed to say more. He needed to warn her about the infection spreading in the ward, the sweet, rotten smell that clung to the dressings of the men in beds 4 through 6. He started to write. "The flowers in the garden are wilting." He stopped, the nib hovering as he realized wilting was too close, too honest. The censor knew their codes. They were learning. If he wrote about dying flowers, they might flag it or hold the letter, leaving Elsie with nothing. Silence was worse than a lie. He scraped the nib against the paper, removing the wet ink. A small gray smudge remained. He rewrote the line. "The frozen flowers are sleeping under the snow." Safer yet vague, it sacrificed clarity for safety, and he hated it. He hated the way the words sat on the page, pretty and useless, but he continued. Filling the page with talk of snow and elves and locked wardrobes, he built a wall of fiction high enough to keep the reality out. Arthur shifted in his bed. The springs creaked. "You're writing a novel," Arthur said. "Keep it brief. They don't like pages." "They read every word," Thomas said, not looking up. "Every comma." "Then give them nothing to chew on." Thomas signed his name. He blotted the page. The coarse paper absorbed the excess, leaving a faint shadow. He folded it, aligning the edges. He needed it to be perfect. Any crease looked like haste. Any haste looked like guilt. He reached for the envelope. As he slid the letter in, something else fell out from under his pillow. A formal slip, printed on stiff card. He had found it tucked under his meal tray an hour ago, unnoticed until now. He picked it up. The text was typed impersonal. Notice of special review. All future correspondence from patient 402 subject to extended scrutiny. Effective immediately. Thomas stared at the words, the ink seeming to vibrate on the card. Extended scrutiny meant they would hold the letters longer, parsing the metaphors to look for cracks in the myth. It meant the code was compromised. "What's that?" Arthur asked. He leaned over, trying to see the card. "Nothing," Thomas said, as he slipped the notice into his pajama pocket, where the card dug hard and sharp into his thigh. "Just a reminder." "About what?" "About Tuesday," Thomas said. "The board." He sealed the envelope. The glue tasted of chemicals and starch. He licked it shut, the sound loud in the quiet ward. He had sent the warning. He had hidden the truth. But the net was closing. The censor was no longer just cutting words. He was watching the writer. Thomas placed the letter on the locker. He looked at his hand. It was steady, but he felt a coldness spreading up his arm, starting from the pocket where the notice lay. He wondered if another cup had fallen in Bethnal Green, or a plate, or a picture frame. The workshop was taking its due, and the price was rising. He lay back, the starched case crackling against his neck as he closed his eyes. He needed to sleep, to dream of snow, to forget the smell of the ink. But the card in his pocket burned against his leg, a reminder that the next letter might not go through at all. The ward door opened. The orderly stepped in, the leather bag swinging at his hip. He walked towards the lockers, collecting the post. Thomas watched him. He waited until the orderly reached his bed before he picked up the envelope. He handed it over. The orderly took it without looking, dropping it into the bag. The buckle clicked shut. "Special delivery for you later, Penhaligon," the orderly said. He paused, his hand on the strap. "From the office." Thomas nodded, silent, and watched the orderly leave while the bag swung like a collection of silenced voices. As the doors closed, the ward settled into its uneasy quiet. Reaching into his pocket, Thomas touched the card again. Its edges were sharp. He pulled it out to look at it one more time. Extended scrutiny. He folded the card, put it back, and picked up his pen, knowing he had to write another letter to warn Elsie, yet wondering what he could possibly say. If he wrote, "They are watching," they would watch. If he wrote, "Stop writing," she would worry. He dipped the pen into ink so black it looked like a hole in the page. He began to write, "Dear Elsie, the snow is deep." He stopped, looking at the wall, where the crack ran from the picture rail to the skirting board like a river flowing nowhere. He put the pen down. He would wait until the special delivery arrived, seeing what they sent him before he spoke again. The clock ticked. The sound was loud. It marked the seconds until the next dressing change, the next meal, the next lie. Thomas turned onto his side. He faced the wall. He closed his eyes. He waited for the night. The nib caught on a rough fiber in the paper, tearing a tiny hole that swallowed the ink. Thomas watched the black pool spread, widening like a bruise beneath the skin of the page. He held his breath. The ward smelled of carbolic acid and boiled cabbage, a scent that clung to the back of the throat, no matter how much water one drank. Bed 6 lay 2 rows over, separated only by a thin canvas screen that did nothing to stop the smell of sweet rot drifting across the floorboards. He looked at the sentence he had started. "The infection is spreading." Too direct, the censor would cut it out with scissors, leaving a jagged gap where the truth used to be. Elsie would see the white space and know. She would know men were dying here, not from bullets, but from the air itself, from the mud that worked its way into the blood and turned it black. He could not send that. He could not put that weight into the post bag. Thomas pressed the nib harder. The paper dimpled. He needed a code. The workshop. The elf. Something that sounded like a child's tale but carried the stain of the ward. He moved the pen again. "The garden is suffering." No, suffering was a human word. Plants did not suffer. They wilted. They froze. He lifted the pen. His hand trembled just slightly, a vibration that started in the wrist and traveled up to the elbow. The muscle there felt tight, knotted like old rope. He thought of the boy in bed 6. The leg was gone, taken above the knee 3 days ago, yet the smell remained. It was a smell of old cheese and damp earth, of things left out in the sun too long. Thomas closed his eyes. He saw the dressing on the stump, greenish pus seeping through the lint. The matron had shaken her head when she changed it, her mouth a thin line of powder and silence. She had not spoken. She had just wrapped the fresh gauze and moved to the next bed, her starched skirt rustling like dry leaves. He opened his eyes. The page waited. The frozen flowers are dying. He stopped dying, forbidden. The censor looked for that word. They looked for any admission of loss. If he wrote it, the letter would be detained. Elsie would wait by the door in Bethnal Green, watching the postman, hoping for a letter that would never come. Silence was worse than a lie. A lie could be read. A detained letter was a void. He grabbed the knife from the locker. It was a small penknife, the blade dull from use. He scraped the wet ink from the page. The paper fiber rose up in tiny grey rolls, gathering at the edge of the blade. He blew them away. They landed on the blanket, dark specks on the white wool. A mess. He brushed them off. Now the page was damaged, a thin patch where the surface had been abraded that looked like a scar. He dipped the pen again. The inkwell was nearly empty, the liquid thick and sluggish, so he had to press hard to make it flow. The frozen flowers are sleeping under the snow. Better sleeping implied waking. Snow implied purity. It was a lie, but it was a safe one. It protected her. It protected him. He watched the words dry. They looked innocent. They looked like something a brother would write to a sister who worked in a factory filling shells with cordite, her hands stained yellow with TNT, her skin turning the color of old parchment. He did not write about her hands. He wrote about the elf's workshop. He wrote about the gears jamming. He wrote about the cold. Arthur shifted in the next bed. The iron frame groaned under the weight of his body. "You're writing a novel," Arthur said. His voice was rough, scraped raw by the cough that had kept him awake half the night. "Keep it brief. They don't like pages." Thomas did not look up. He kept his eyes on the paper. They read every word, every comma. "Then give them nothing to chew on." "I am trying." Thomas signed his name. The letters were cramped, lacking their usual flourish. He blotted the page. The coarse paper absorbed the excess, leaving a faint shadow beneath the signature. He folded the letter. He aligned the edges perfectly. Any crease looked like haste. Any haste looked like guilt. He needed it to be flawless. He needed the censor to find nothing but nonsense. He reached for the envelope. As he slid the letter inside, his hand brushed against something stiff beneath his pillow. He had not put anything there. He paused. The envelope hung half open in his hand. He withdrew his other hand and felt around the pillowcase. His fingers found a corner of card, stiff, printed. He pulled it out. It was a formal slip, typed on heavy stock. The ink was fresh, smelling of the mimeograph machine used in the administration office. He held it up to the dim light of the ward. The letters were sharp, impersonal. Notice of special review. All future correspondence from patient 402 subject to extended scrutiny, effective immediately. Thomas stared at the words as the air in the ward seemed to thicken, the smell of carbolic growing stronger until it coated his tongue. Extended scrutiny. It meant they were not just cutting words anymore, but reading between them, parsing the metaphors to look for cracks in the myth. They knew, or they suspected. "What's that?" Arthur asked, leaning over until the springs creaked as he tried to see the card. Thomas slipped the notice into his pajama pocket. The card dug into his thigh, hard and sharp. Nothing. "About what?" "About Tuesday." Thomas's voice sounded flat to his own ears. "The board." He sealed the envelope. The glue tasted of chemicals and starch. He licked it shut. The sound was loud in the quiet ward, a small wet tear in the stillness. He had sent the warning. He had hidden the truth. But the net was closing. The censor was no longer just cutting words. He was watching the writer. Thomas placed the letter on the locker. He looked at his hand. It was steady, but he felt a coldness spreading up his arm, starting from the pocket where the notice lay. He wondered if another cup had fallen in Bethnal Green, or a plate, or a picture frame. The workshop was taking its due, and the price was rising. Every lie he told to keep them safe cost something real, something tangible. He lay back as the starched case crackled against his neck, and he closed his eyes because he needed to sleep, to dream of snow, to forget the smell of the ink. but the card in his pocket burned against his leg, a reminder that the next letter might not go through at all. The ward door opened. The orderly stepped in, the leather bag swinging at his hip. He walked towards the lockers, collecting the post. Thomas watched him. He waited until the orderly reached his bed before he picked up the envelope. He handed it over. The orderly took it without looking, dropping it into the bag. The buckle clicked shut. "Special delivery for you later, Penhaligon," the orderly said. He paused, his hand on the strap. "From the office." Thomas nodded. He did not speak. He watched the orderly leave. The bag swung, a collection of silenced voices. When the doors closed, the ward settled into its uneasy quiet. Thomas reached into his pocket. He touched the card again. The edges were sharp. He pulled it out and looked at it one more time. Extended scrutiny. He folded the card. He put it back. He picked up his pen. He had to write another letter. He had to warn Elsie. But what could he say? If he wrote, "They are watching," they would watch. If he wrote, "Stop writing," she would worry. He dipped the pen. The ink was black. It looked like a hole in the page. He began to write, "Dear Elsie, the snow is deep." Segment 1, he stopped. He looked at the wall. Option A, he stopped, looking at the wall. Too smooth. Option B, he stopped, his gaze fixed on the wall. Two short sentences, okay. Option C, he stopped, then looked at the wall. One medium. Let's try to braid. He stopped, while looking at the wall. Draft. The clock ticked, a loud sound marking the seconds until the next dressing change, the next meal, the next lie. Thomas turned onto his side and faced the wall. He closed his eyes, waiting for the night. The water bit into her knuckles, cold enough to sting the raw patches where the skin had cracked from the sulfur. Elsie scrubbed. Hard. The iron sink was chipped around the plug hole, stained a permanent brown where the runoff from 1,000 shifts had eaten into the enamel. She turned the tap off. The pipes groaned, a deep metallic shudder that vibrated through the basin and up her forearms. She held her hands over the bowl. They dripped. The water running down her wrists was clear, but the skin beneath was not. It was yellow, a deep, sickly saffron hue that had started at her fingertips and was creeping up towards her elbows, settling into the pores like pollen from a poisonous flower. She turned her palms over. The lines of her life were dyed gold. "Proper Canary, you are." Mary stood at the next basin, wringing out a rag. Her own hands were wrapped in a dirty cloth, hiding the same stain. She didn't look up. "Shut it, Mary. Foreman'll see, send you home." "He won't." Elsie grabbed the rough towel from the rack. It smelled of damp wool and lye. She rubbed her wrists until the skin burned red beneath the yellow. "Not unless I tell him why." "Tell him the dust got in." "It's not dust." Mary spat into the sink, watching the water swirl and carry the grey grit away. "Doesn't matter what it is, matters what they see. If you go home, you don't get the shilling, and your mum needs that shilling." Elsie dropped the towel. It landed with a wet slap on the tiles. She knew Mary was right. The essential work order had them locked in tighter than any prison cell. Quitting meant the police, and the police meant trouble the family couldn't afford. But looking at her hands, she felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach that had nothing to do with the drafty washroom. This wasn't just dirt. It was the shell filling seeping into her blood. Toxic, slow. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the folded sheet of notepaper. It was cheap, thin stuff that blurred if you held the pen too long. She had stolen 10 minutes before the shift whistle, hiding in here while the others queued for the canteen. She needed to write to Thomas. She needed to tell him about the yellow without making Mum and Dad worry. The pen scratched against the paper. "Dear Tom." She stopped. The ink pooled at the tip of the nib. If she wrote, "I am poisoning myself," the censor would cut it out. Maybe confiscate the whole letter. Then Thomas would get nothing, and he would think she was dead. Or worse, he would think she was well and ignoring him. She had to use the code, the workshop. "The elf has been busy," she wrote. "His workshop is so full of magic that the gold dust is sticking to me." It sounded childish, like a story for Arthur, not a warning for a brother who was knee-deep in gangrene in France. But it was the only language they had left. She pressed harder. The paper dimpled. "He says it is a sign of favor, that I am becoming part of the machinery. She paused. The whistle blew in the distance, a long, shrill scream that echoed off the brick walls. The girls outside began to move, the heavy thud of boots on the corridor floor. She had to finish. She thought of home. Yesterday she had noticed the blue teacup on the sideboard had a new crack running from the rim to the base. Mum had said she didn't recall dropping it. Elsie knew better. Every lie cost something. Every time they shielded the parents from the truth, the house lost a piece of itself. Soon there would be nothing left but the walls. Do not worry about the color, she added, her handwriting tightening as the minutes slipped away. It washes off eventually. Everything does. That was a lie. She knew it wouldn't wash off. She knew women who had stayed yellow for months after they left the factory, their skin like parchment, their breath smelling of almonds and rot. But Thomas needed to know she was still working, still fighting, still keeping the myth alive so the parents could sleep. She folded the letter. The crease was sharp. She slipped it into the envelope and licked the flap. The glue tasted of starch and chemicals, the same taste that lingered at the back of her throat all day. She sealed it. Come on, Els. Mary was at the door. She had her coat on now, the heavy wool pulled tight against the chill. Bell's done. Coming. Elsie shoved the letter into her own coat pocket. She would post it on the way out. If she gave it to the collection now, the censor might hold it until Tuesday. If she posted it herself at the box on the corner, it might slip through faster. A gamble. Everything was a gamble now. She followed Mary out into the corridor. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and sweat, a heavy blanket that settled on the tongue. The women walked in a stream, heads down, faces pale beneath the grime. No one spoke. The noise of the factory floor began to build, a low rumble that grew into a roar as they approached the sheds. It sounded like thunder trapped indoors. Elsie touched her pocket. The letter was there, a small packet of truth wrapped in lies. She thought of Thomas. He would be waiting for the post. He would read the words about the gold dust and know what they meant. He would know she was sick, and he would write back with a story about lions to make her feel brave. They reached the workbench. The shells waited in rows, brass casings gleaming under the gaslights. They looked innocent, just metal, but she knew what went inside. She picked up her tool. The weight of it was familiar in her hand, cold and heavy. Phil, the foreman shouted. He walked the line, checking the weights. Elsie began to work, scoop, pack, press, until the rhythm took over. Scoop, pack, press. Her hands moved automatically while her mind drifted elsewhere, fixed on the teacup. She wondered if it had cracked all the way through yet, and whether, by the time Thomas received the letter, the handle would fall off in Mum's hand. The noise of the press drowned out her thoughts. It was a relentless hammering, beat after beat, driving the cordite into the brass. She didn't flinch. She didn't stop. She just worked, letting the yellow stain on her skin deepen with every scoop, paying the price for the safety of a home that was slowly disappearing around them. She glanced at the clock on the wall. It was slow, 10 minutes behind the whistle. She didn't care. Time didn't matter here. Only the output. Only the shells. Only the letter in her pocket that would travel 3 days to reach a hospital bed where a boy who used to chase her in the park was now waiting for a king's summons. Steady, Mary hissed after she had dropped a measure, the powder spilling across the bench until she swept it back with a careless hand. Elsie said nothing, just kept working through the rhythm of scoop, pack, and press. She let the dust stick and the cup break, knowing that as long as the letter went out and the code held, they could keep the wolves from the door. It didn't matter if the door itself was rotting away. The shift dragged on, her shoulders ached. The smell of sulfur coated her eyes, making them water. She blinked the tears away. She wouldn't cry, not here. She saved the crying for the walk home when the streets were dark and the Zeppelins might be overhead. When the whistle finally blew for the break, she didn't go to the canteen. She went to the door. She stepped out into the grey afternoon. The sky was low, pressing down on the rooftops of Woolwich. She walked to the corner where the red post box stood. It was chipped, the paint peeling. She pushed the envelope into the slot. It fell with a soft thud. Gone. She stood there for a moment, her hand resting on the iron until the cold seeped into her palm. Turning, she walked back towards the factory, where the yellow on her hands seemed brighter in the daylight. It was gold dust. As she curled her fingers into a fist, the color intensified. Right then, she said to the empty street. She went back inside. The machines were waiting. The Lion King was roaring, and she had to feed him. The water in the basin ran yellow before it even touched her skin. Elsie scrubbed, the bristles of the nail brush biting into the cuticles until they bled, a thin, bright red that mixed with the toxic stain, swirling down the plug hole in a sickly maroon vortex. It wouldn't come off. Nothing came off. The picric acid had sunk deep, binding to the proteins of her flesh like a dye set in boiling vinegar, turning her palms and the undersides of her fingers the color of old parchment, of jaundice, of a warning flag no one was allowed to read. She held her hands up to the grimy mirror above the sink. The glass was spotted with mold and fingerprints, distorting her reflection until she looked like a creature from one of the fairy tales Mum used to read by the fire, a girl touched by magic who would never be clean again. Gold dust, she whispered to the empty room. The words felt thick on her tongue. The elf's been generous. It was a lie, but a necessary one. If she wrote poison, the censor's black ink would swallow the sentence whole, and Thomas would receive a page of white silence that screamed louder than any confession. If she wrote sick, the matron at the Third London might intercept it, fearing panic among the convalescents. So it had to be magic. It had to be the workshop. She dried her hands on the rough towel, the fibers catching on the dry, flaking skin of her wrists. The yellow glowed under the gas jet, unmistakable, undeniable. She flexed her fingers. They felt stiff, the joints creaking like old floorboards. She sat at the small table in the corner of the washroom, pulling the sheet of paper towards her. The pen felt heavy, an anchor dragging through the mud of her exhaustion. "Dear Tom," she wrote, the nib scratching hard against the surface. "The workshop is busy tonight. The elf is working overtime, I think. He's spilled his sack again. There's gold dust everywhere. It's on my hands, on my apron, even in my hair. It sticks like burrs. Mum would have a fit if she saw me, saying I've been rolling in the soot, but I tell her it's just the magic. It's the price of making the toys for the boys at the front." She paused. The ink pooled at the end of the line, a dark bead threatening to drop. She wiped it quickly with her thumb, leaving a smudge. "Don't worry about the color. It washes off eventually. Everything does." The lie tasted of ash. She knew women who had left the factory months ago, their skin still stained, their breath carrying the sweet almond scent of the chemical long after they'd stopped filling shells. She knew some of them coughed up blood in the mornings, delicate pink froth on their handkerchiefs that they hid in the pockets of their coats. But Thomas didn't need to know that. Thomas needed to know she was still standing, still filling the quota, still holding up her end of the bargain. She dipped the pen again. "How are you? Is the Lion King still roaring? Though I hope he is tired soon. Even lions need to sleep, don't they?" She folded the letter. The crease was sharp, a white line cutting through the yellow stain on her fingertips. She slid it into the envelope, licked the flap. The glue tasted of chemicals, the same metallic tang that coated the back of her throat every time she inhaled too deeply on the factory floor. She sealed it. Outside, the bell screamed, a long, shrill note that vibrated in her teeth. The girls in the corridor began to move, the heavy thud of boots on the concrete, the shuffling of weary bodies returning to the line. Elsie shoved the letter into her coat pocket, pressing it against her ribs. She would post it herself. If she dropped it in the factory collection, the censor might hold it until Tuesday, picking over every word for signs of dissent. If she walked it to the box on the corner, past the watchful eyes of the foreman, it might slip through the net. A gamble. Everything was a gamble now, a roll of the dice with lives as the stakes. She stepped out into the corridor. The air was heavy, a physical weight pressing against her chest, thick with the smell of cordite and unwashed bodies. The women moved in a stream, heads bowed, faces pale beneath the grime, eyes fixed on the floor. No one spoke. The roar of the factory floor began to build as they approached the sheds, a low rumble that grew into a deafening thunder, the sound of a storm trapped indoors, shaking the very foundations of the building. It sounded like the end of the world, over and over again, shift after shift. Elsie touched her pocket. The paper crinkled softly. Thomas would be waiting. He would read the words about the gold dust and know. He would know she was poisoning herself slowly, surely, trading her health for the shells that tore men apart in France. And he would write back. He would send a story about lions, about kings, about anything but the truth of his own pain. They were trading lies like currency, buying each other time. They reached the workbench. The rows of brass shells waited, gleaming under the harsh gaslights, innocent and deadly. She picked up her tool. It was cold, heavy, familiar in her hand. "Phil," the foreman shouted, pacing the line, his eyes darting from face to face, checking for slowness, for weakness. Elsie began to work, scoop the powder, pack it down with the wooden rammer, press the casing into place, scoop, pack, press. The rhythmic motion took over, her body moving on instinct while her mind drifted away, floating above the noise and the smell. She thought of the teacup at home, the blue one with the chip. She wondered if the crack had spread while she was here. She wondered if, by the time her letter reached Thomas, the handle would snap off in Mum's hand, leaving her holding a broken vessel, confused and hurt, wondering how such a thing could happen without a sound. The press hammered on, a relentless beat driving the explosive into the metal. She didn't flinch. She couldn't. She let the yellow dust settle into the pores of her skin, let it stain her deeper with every movement. It was the cost, the price of the myth. As long as the code held, as long as they kept the story alive, the wolves couldn't get in, even if the house itself was rotting around them, beam by beam, cup by cup. She glanced at the clock on the far wall, where the hands crawled, sluggish and slow. 10 minutes behind the whistle, probably, though it didn't matter. Time had no meaning here. There was only the output, the shells. In her pocket lay a letter that would take 3 days to cross the city, reaching a hospital bed where her brother waited for a summons he prayed wouldn't come. "Steady," Mary hissed beside her. A measure had tipped, a small spill of yellow powder on the bench. Mary swept it back with her bare hand, careless, desperate not to lose the count. Elsie said nothing, keeping the rhythm, scoop, pack, press, letting the dust stick. Let the cup break, let the house fall. As long as the letter flew, as long as Thomas knew she was still fighting, they could keep the darkness at bay. The shift dragged on, an eternity of noise and vibration. Her shoulders burned. The sulfur smell coated her eyes, stinging, making them water. She blinked 3 degrees away, rough and quick. Not here, never here. She saved the tears for the walk home, for the dark streets where the zeppelins might drift overhead like silent sharks, hunting for the glow of the city. When the whistle finally cut through the noise, signaling the break, she didn't turn towards the canteen. She turned for the door. She pushed out into the grey afternoon, the sudden quiet ringing in her ears. The sky hung low, a blanket of soot-colored cloud pressing down on the rooftops of Woolworth. She walked to the corner, her boots clattering on the pavement. The red post box stood there, chipped and peeling, a solitary sentinel in the gloom. She pushed the envelope into the slot. It fell with a soft, final thud. "Gone." She stood there for a moment, her palm flat against the cold iron. The chill seeped into her skin, a sharp contrast to the heat of the factory. She turned, walking back towards the gates. The yellow on her hands seemed to glow in the dull light, gold dust. She curled her fingers into a fist, hiding the stain, hiding the truth. "Right then," she said to the empty street. Her voice sounded small, swallowed by the vast, grey silence of the city. She went back inside. The machines were waiting. The Lion King was roaring, hungry and endless, and she had to feed him. The wash basin water ran brown, then clear, then brown again. Elsie scrubbed until the skin roared, the pumice stone catching on the ridges of her palms, but the color would not shift. It sat deep in the pores, a jaundice that no amount of carbolic soap could touch. She leaned closer to the cracked mirror, the glass silvering at the edges where the damp had eaten it away. Her face looked back, pale and thin, but the hands resting on the chipped porcelain were bright, unmistakable yellow. "Gold dust," she whispered to the reflection. The words tasted like ash. In the letter she had posted an hour ago, she had called it a gift from the elf, a sprinkling of magic that marked the workers who kept the workshop warm. A lie, a necessary, rotting lie. If Mum saw these hands, she would scream. She would drag Elsie to the doctor, demand answers, ask why the government was painting her daughter in poison. And then the letters would stop. The censor would take them all, sniffing out the truth of the toxicity, the reality of the TNT sickness that turned skin to parchment and livers to mush. She dried her hands on the rough towel, the fibers catching on the stained skin. It felt like sandpaper, like the front, though she had never seen it. Thomas described the mud in his letters, the way it sucked at boots and swallowed men whole. Here the dust did the same work, only slower. It crept up the wrists, a tide of sulfur rising to meet the elbows. By Christmas, she might be entirely gold, a statue in the factory, frozen in the act of filling shells. "Move it, Penhaligon." Mary stood in the doorway, wiping her own hands on her apron. Her face was smudged with grease, eyes tired. She didn't look at Elsie's hands. Everyone knew. Everyone ignored it. "Coming," Elsie said. She turned from the basin. The corridor stretched out, dim and smelling of wet wool and stale tea. The roar of the presses waited at the end of it, a constant, thrumming beast that never slept. She walked towards it, her steps heavy. The yellow on her palms seemed to pulse in the low light, a beacon of the cost they were all paying. Tuesday at the 3rd London General meant the board. Thomas sat on the edge of the narrow bed, the sheet pulled up to his waist. His leg throbbed, a deep, dull ache that settled in the bone just above the knee where the shrapnel had torn through. The air in the ward was thick with the scent of iodine and boiled cabbage, a smell that clung to the back of the throat. He watched the orderly push a trolley down the aisle, the wheels squeaking on the linoleum, a high-pitched whine that set his teeth on edge. "Penhaligon." The nurse stood at the foot of the bed, holding a clipboard. Her cap was stiff, white, unmoving. "Boardroom, now." Thomas nodded. He swung his legs over the side, the movement sending a jolt of pain up his thigh. He gritted his teeth, grabbing the crutches leaning against the wall. The wood was smooth, worn by the hands of 100 men before him. He pushed himself up, balancing for a moment before finding his rhythm. Left crutch, right leg, left crutch. A clumsy dance. The corridor was cold. Drafts slipped through the sash windows, rattling the panes. He passed other men, some sitting in chairs, others pacing, all waiting for the same verdict. The silence between them was heavy, a shared understanding of what lay ahead. No one spoke. What was there to say? The boardroom door was closed. Thomas knocked, the sound sharp and brittle in the quiet hall. "Enter." He pushed the door open. 3 officers sat behind a long table, their uniforms crisp, their faces unreadable. The colonel in the center held a file, Thomas's file. He didn't look up immediately. He turned a page, the paper rustling loudly in the stillness. "Penhaligon, Thomas, RAMC." "Yes, sir." The colonel looked up then. His eyes were pale, distant, as if he were looking through Thomas rather than at him. "Leg healing well." "Stiff, sir, but healing." "And the pain?" "Manageable." A lie, the pain was a constant companion, a fire that burned deep in the marrow. But he couldn't say that, not here, not to them. The colonel nodded, making a note on the paper. The scratch of the pen was the only sound in the room. "Fit for light duty," the colonel said, his voice flat. "Return to unit in France. Transport leaves Thursday." Thomas felt the floor tilt slightly. France, the mud, the blood, the noise. He had hoped somehow that this leg would be his ticket out, a permanent disability, a chance to stay in London, near Elsie, near home. But the war didn't care about hope. It needed bodies. "Thursday, sir." "Affirmative, dismissed." Thomas saluted, the movement automatic. He turned and walked out, the crutches clicking on the floor. The corridor seemed longer now, the shadows deeper. He made it back to the ward, collapsing onto the bed. The sheet was still warm where he had been. He reached for his writing pad. The pen felt heavy in his hand. He had to write to Elsie. He had to tell her, but he couldn't say the words, "I am going back. I am going to die." He dipped the nib in the ink. It pooled, black and glossy. "Dearest Elsie, the Lion King has summoned the head elf for a meeting today. A great honor, they say. The workshop is to be expanded, and the head elf must travel to the king's castle to discuss the new arrangements. It seems the frost here was not enough. The king requires the cold from the source." He paused. The ink dried on the nib. He wiped it on the edge of the pot. "Do not worry. The journey is short, and the king is known for his generosity. He always provides a warm fire for his guests. I shall pack my best coat, the one with the silver buttons. Tell Mum the elf sends his regards and that the snow in the garden is particularly beautiful this year. He signed his name. The letters were shaky, the ink blotting slightly where his hand had trembled. He folded the paper, sliding it into an envelope. Then he reached into his locker and pulled out the deployment chit. The official paper, stamped with the royal seal, the order that sent him back to the hell he had escaped. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he took the pen again and drew a thick black line through the dates, through the destination, through the reality of it. "Keep this ticket safe," he wrote on the back. "It is a souvenir of the king's party. One day we shall use it to leave the workshop behind." He sealed the envelope. His hands shook as he licked the flap. The taste of the glue was sour, chemical. He placed the letter on the pile for collection. It would go out tomorrow. It would reach her in 3 days. By then he would be on a train, or a boat, or in the mud. He lay back on the pillow, staring at the ceiling. The plaster was cracked, a web of fine lines spreading across the white surface, like the cracks in the teacup, like the cracks in the myth. 2 days later, the letters arrived together. Elsie sat at the kitchen table, the gas lamp flickering above her. Mum was in the scullery, washing up. The sound of clattering plates drifted through the door. Elsie held both envelopes in her hands, one from Thomas, the paper thick and creamy, the other, a standard issue form, but she knew what it was before she opened it. She had seen the stamp on the outside. She opened Thomas's first. She read the words about the Lion King and the head elf. She read about the silver buttons and the snow. Her throat tightened. She knew what it meant. The meeting, the journey, the end of the stay. Then she opened the second letter, the deployment chit, the black line through the dates. "Keep this ticket safe." She traced the ink with her finger. The line was thick, desperate, a child's attempt to cross out the truth. She looked down at her own hands, resting on the table. The yellow was deeper now, spreading up her wrists. Gold dust. She didn't cry, she couldn't. Mum was in the next room. The myth had to hold. "Mum," she called out, her voice steady. "Thomas wrote, 'The elf is visiting the king.' It sounds wonderful." "That's nice, love," Mum called back, the water running in the sink. "Tell him we say hello." Elsie folded the letters together. She tied them with a piece of red string, the same kind she used for the parcels. She placed them in the drawer, under the spoons, safe, hidden. She stood up and walked to the window. The street outside was dark, the gaslights casting long, wavering shadows on the pavement. Somewhere, far away, a train was whistling, a long, low sound that drifted on the wind. She pressed her hand against the cold glass. The yellow stain left a faint mark on the pane. "Safe," she whispered. But the house felt smaller suddenly, the walls closer. The teacup in the cupboard seemed to shimmer, a new crack appearing in the handle, invisible to the eye but felt in the bone. The train whistle blew again, closer this time, coming to take the head elf away. Elsie turned from the window. She had to get back to the factory. The Lion King was waiting, and he was always hungry. The smell of wet wool and carbolic acid hung heavy in the ward, a damp blanket that no amount of scrubbing could lift. Thomas shifted his leg, the splint digging into the calf muscle where the flesh had begun to knit poorly. "Oi, Penhaligon," Miller whispered from the next bed, his voice a dry rasp against the silence of the sleeping men. "You hear the talk." Thomas kept his eyes on the ceiling, tracing the hairline fracture in the plaster that ran from the light fixture to the window frame. "What talk?" "From the orderlies. Says the Jerrys have put up trees along their wire, Christmas trees, with candles." Miller propped himself up on one elbow, the movement causing the metal frame of his bed to groan in protest. "Says they're singing, still Nacht, or whatever it is in their tongue." Thomas turned his head slowly. The pain in his thigh spiked, a sharp electric jolt that made him grit his teeth. He looked at Miller, whose face was gaunt, the shadows under his eyes deep enough to hide in. "Singing," Thomas repeated. The word felt strange, foreign in this place of groans and the wet cough of dying lungs. "I and no shooting, not since last night, quiet as a church." Miller dropped back onto his pillow, staring at the ceiling now too. "Reckon it's a trick, to get us to pop our heads up. Maybe, Thomas said. He reached for the small table beside his bed, his fingers brushing against the cold metal of the inkwell. Or maybe they're just tired. He pulled the paper closer. The nib of his pen hovered over the surface, poised to commit another lie to the post. He needed to tell Mum and Dad about the elf, about the workshop. But the reality of the ward, the sudden, bewildering silence outside the windows, pressed against him. If he wrote of peace, and the guns started again tomorrow, the lie would break them. It would shatter the fragile glass house they had built in Bethnal Green. He dipped the pen. The ink flowed, dark and viscous. Dearest Mum and Dad. The weather here has taken a turn for the miraculous. It seems the Lion King has grown weary of his roaring. He has sent a messenger to the workshop, a white flag tied to a branch of holly. The elf has agreed to a treaty just for tonight. The fires are banked and the tools are laid down. He paused. The scratch of Miller turning over in the next bed sounded like a dry leaf skittering on stone. It is a strange thing to hear silence where there should be thunder. The snow lies untouched between the lines, pure and white as the tablecloth on Sundays. I imagine the elf walking out onto the frozen ground, meeting the lion in the middle. They do not speak, of course. Kings and elves rarely do. They simply nod, and for a few hours the world holds its breath. Thomas stopped. The phrase snagged in his throat, holds its breath. No, too close, too honest. He scratched it out with a violent crosshatch of ink, ruining the line. He would have to rewrite the whole page. Writing home? Miller asked, his eyes closed. Yes, Thomas said, telling them about the snow. Good, Miller murmured. Let them have the snow. We've got enough of the rest. Thomas looked down at his hand. The yellow stain of iodine on his fingers seemed brighter in the dim light. He started the sentence again, forcing his hand to steady. The treaty is fragile, of course, like ice on a puddle. One wrong step and it cracks. But for now, the stars above the workshop are frozen in place, watching over us. They say the elf has brought gifts, though I have seen none. Perhaps the gift is simply the quiet. Perhaps that is enough. He signed his name, Thomas. The letters were cramped, lacking their usual flourish. He blew on the wet ink, watching it shimmer before dulling to a matte black. Outside, a sound drifted through the open window. Faint, carried on the cold air. Singing, not the harsh bark of commands, not the scream of shells. Voices, men's voices, blending in a harmony that belonged in a cathedral, not a muddy field in France. O come, Emmanuel. Thomas closed his eyes. The melody tangled with the memory of the chapel in Bethnal Green, of Dad's off-key baritone and the smell of beeswax candles. It hurt, a physical ache in the center of his chest, sharp and hollow. He folded the letter. The paper crackled, a loud sound in the quiet ward. He slipped it into the envelope, sealing it with a dab of glue that tasted of starch and regret. Miller, he said softly. Do you think it will last, the quiet? Miller didn't answer immediately. The singing outside had grown louder, joined now by voices from the British line, responding in kind. And ransom captive Israel. Until midnight, Miller said finally, maybe Boxing Day, then the lion wakes up hungry again. Thomas placed the letter on the pile by the door. It looked small, insignificant against the grey walls. A piece of paper promising a peace that might not survive the sunrise. He lay back, pulling the rough blanket up to his chin. The cold seeped through the mattress, settling into his bones. He thought of Elsie, somewhere in London, filling shells with cordite. Did she hear the singing too? Did she feel the treaty in the air, or was the factory noise too loud? Sleep well, Tom, Miller whispered. You too, Thomas said. He closed his eyes, listening to the voices weaving together in the dark, a temporary bridge over the abyss. For tonight, the lion slept. For tonight, the elf reigned. But the dawn was coming, and with it, the mud. He reached for his pencil again, scratching a final note at the bottom of the page, a postscript for a future that might not arrive. If the snow turns brown tomorrow, do not be alarmed. It is just the earth waking up. He put the pencil down. The singing faded into the wind, leaving only the sound of breathing, shallow and uneven, filling the ward. Waiting. The factory floor did not sleep. It breathed in shallow, rhythmic gasps, a mechanical lung inflating and deflating with the grind of the presses. Elsie stood at bench 4, her fingers numb inside the thin cotton gloves, the yellow dust of the trinitrotoluene coating her skin like a second, sickly epidermis. The air tasted of sulfur and hot metal, a grit that settled in the back of the throat and refused to be swallowed. Around her, the women moved in a trance, their faces masks of concentration, eyes fixed on the brass shells waiting to be filled. "Keep the rhythm, girls," the foreman called out, his voice cutting through the drone. "King and country don't stop for Christmas Eve." Icy dipped her measure into the vat. The powder was fine, golden, deceptive. It looked like the dust the elf might sprinkle on the workshop floor to make the toys glide, not the stuff that would tear a boy's leg off 300 miles away. She packed it tight, the rammer heavy in her hand, a repetitive thud-thud-thud that matched the beating of her own heart. Thud, pack, thud, seal. A girl 2 benches down, Mary, stumbled, her knee buckled, and she caught herself on the edge of the table, sending a cascade of empty casings clattering to the concrete. The sound was sharp, violent, like a pistol shot in a library. The lines stopped. 20 heads turned. "Get up," the foreman barked, striding over, his boots echoing on the wet floor. "We aren't running a nursery." Mary scrambled to her feet, her face pale beneath the grime. "Sorry, sir, just dizzy." "Dizzy is a luxury," he snapped. "Pick them up, now." Elsie watched Mary's trembling hands gather the brass. The girl's skin was yellow too, the color of old parchment, the toxins seeping into her pores day by day. Elsie looked down at her own hands. They were the color of a canary, bright and unnatural against the gray steel of the bench. She flexed her fingers, stiff. The joints ached with a deep, bone-weary throb. She reached for the scrap of paper tucked into her apron pocket. It was crumpled, soft from being handled too many times. She had started this letter 3 days ago, adding a line whenever the foreman's back was turned. "Dearest Thomas, the workshop is busy tonight. The elf has ordered a double shift to ensure the gifts are ready. The lights are burning bright, brighter than usual, casting long shadows against the walls. We are filling the boxes with gold dust, packing it tight so nothing breaks during the journey. The Lion King must be hungry, for the order is vast, endless." She paused, the pen hovering. The ink was cheap, watery, spreading slightly on the rough paper. She needed to tell him about the silence, the strange quiet that had settled over London since dusk. No sirens, no rumble of trains carrying men to the docks, just the hum of the factory and the distant, muffled sound of bells from a church somewhere in Woolwich. "But there is a strange stillness in the air," she wrote, the letters cramped and hurried. Even the machines seem to whisper. "It is as if the whole world is holding its breath, waiting for a signal. I told Mother that the elf has called a truce with the lion, that they have agreed to lay down their tools for one night." She smiled, Tom. She actually smiled. She said it was a miracle. Elsie stopped. The word miracle sat on the page, bold and dangerous. A lie, a necessary, terrible lie. There was no truce here. The shells she filled tonight would be loaded onto trains on Boxing Day, shipped to France, and fired by men who might be singing carols right now. Men like Thomas. Penhaligon, the foreman's shadow fell across her bench. "Stop dreaming, fill the shell." Elsie jerked the paper into her pocket, her heart hammering against her ribs. She grabbed the rammer. Thud, pack, thud. The rhythm resumed, swallowing her whole. "Yes, sir," she muttered, keeping her eyes on the brass. "Save the prayers for Sunday," he grunted, moving on. "We've got quotas to meet." She worked, the hours blurred, marked only by the ache in her shoulders and the growing stiffness in her fingers. Outside, the world might have been holding its breath, but in here the air was thick with poison and noise. She thought of Thomas in the hospital, his leg wrapped in white lint, the smell of carbolic acid clinging to his clothes. Was he sleeping? Was he watching the snow fall on the muddy fields? "The treaty is fragile," she added to the letter during a brief lull when the press jammed and the line halted for 10 minutes. "Like ice on a puddle. I know that, Tom. I know the lion will wake up hungry. But for tonight, let Mother believe in the elf. Let her think the workshop is safe. It is the only gift I can send her." She folded the paper, tucking it back into her pocket. It felt heavy, weighted with the things she couldn't say. The yellow dust coated the edges of the scrap, staining the white paper with a faint, golden hue. She brushed it off, but the stain remained, just like the color on her skin, just like the memory of the boy who had stood at this bench last week, before the coughing took him and the ambulance came in the night. The shift ended at midnight. The whistle screamed, a shrill, tearing sound that cut through the exhaustion. The women straightened, stretching back stiff from hours of bending. They moved towards the clocking out station in silence, too tired for chatter, too hollow for joy. Elsie stepped out into the cold night air. The sky was clear, the stars sharp and cold above the silhouette of the factory chimneys. No zeppelins, no searchlights sweeping the clouds, just the quiet, a profound, unsettling quiet that made her ears ring. She walked towards the gates, her boots crunching on the frost-covered gravel. A group of men from the night shift stood near the corner, smoking cigarettes, the glowing tips like fireflies in the dark. "Reckon it's true," one of them asked, his voice low. "Heard the Jerrys are singing over there, carols." "Bloody nonsense," another spat. "They'll be shelling us by morning, don't trust a word of it." Elsie pulled her coat tighter around her neck. The cold bit through the wool, settling into her bones. She thought of Thomas's last letter, the one about the Lion King growing weary. She had wanted to believe it. God, how she had wanted to believe it. She reached the main road. The pavement was empty, the shops dark and boarded up. A single gas lamp flickered overhead, casting a pool of weak yellow light on the stones. She stopped beneath it, pulling the letter from her pocket again. She needed to add one more thing, a code, something only Thomas would understand. She found a pencil in her bag, the wood worn smooth from use. Leaning against the cold brick of a shuttered bakery, she scribbled in the margin. "If the snow turns to mud, remember the frozen stars. They are still there, Tom, above the workshop, watching." She blew on the graphite to set it, then folded the letter once more. She would post it first thing in the morning, before the news came, before the lies unraveled. A distant sound rolled across the sky, not thunder, not a train, a low, rhythmic thumping far away to the east, the front, the lion waking up. Elsie flinched, the pencil snapping in her grip. She stared at the horizon, where the sky remained stubbornly dark, hiding the flash of the guns. The quiet was over. The treaty had lasted exactly as long as Miller predicted, until midnight. She shoved the letter deep into her coat pocket, pressing it against her chest, right over her heart. The paper was cold, but the words burned. She started walking again, faster now, her breath pluming in the air, counting the steps between the silence and the storm. 1, 2, 3. The thumping grew louder, a steady, heartbeat rhythm that matched her stride. The earth was waking up, and it was hungry. She turned the corner towards the bus stop, the yellow stain on her hands glowing faintly in the lamplight, a mark of the workshop that would never truly close. The ward smelled of wet wool and the sharp vinegar tang of carbolic, a scent that had long since bored its way into the back of Thomas's throat until he could taste it even when the bottle was capped. He sat propped against the iron bed frame, the sheet pulled high over his legs where the linen bandages ended in a stiff, yellowed ridge. Outside the window, the French countryside lay buried under a blanket of snow so thick it swallowed the wire, the craters, the dead. Silence. A heavy, unnatural quiet that made the orderlies move on tiptoe, as if a loud step might crack the ice and let the war flood back in. Penhaligon, Nurse Gable paused at the foot of his bed, her hands tucked into the pockets of her apron. She looked tired, the skin beneath her eyes bruised purple from lack of sleep. "You should be resting. The fever broke only an hour ago." "Can't sleep, nurse," Thomas said, his voice rough, like gravel grinding in a tin. "Too quiet, makes the ears ring." She nodded, a sharp, jerky motion. "They're singing, out there, in the no-man's land, the Germans and our boys together." She glanced towards the window, her expression unreadable, a mask of professional detachment that didn't quite hide the tremor in her lower lip. "It's Christmas Eve. Seems the lion has laid down to sleep with the lamb, or whatever it is they say in the papers." Thomas picked up his pen. The nib was scratched, catching on the paper, leaving small blobs of ink that looked like flies trapped in amber. He needed to write to Elsie, to tell her the treaty held, but words were dangerous things. They could be twisted by the censor, clipped by the fearful, or simply misunderstood by a mother who needed peace more than truth. He dipped the pen again, watching the ink swell at the tip. "Dearest Elsie," he wrote, the script looping and uneven as his hand shook slightly. "The elf has done it. He has negotiated a treaty with the Lion King. They have agreed to sheath their claws for one night. The workshop is silent. The stars are frozen in the sky, watching over the agreement." He stopped. The lie tasted bitter, metallic, like blood. He knew how fragile such things were. He had seen men shake hands across the wire in 14, only to be cut down by a sniper's bullet an hour after the bells stopped ringing. Hope was a currency that devalued quickly here. If he told Mother the war was over even for a night, and the guns roared at dawn, the crash would break her. Better to wrap it in the myth. Let the elf be the buffer. Let the lion be the excuse. Writing home. Thomas looked up. Miller, from the bed opposite, was leaning forward, his face gaunt, the stubble on his chin gray in the dim light. He held a cigarette, unlit, rolling it between fingers that were stained with iodine. "Trying to," Thomas said. "Hard to find the right words. The censor is a hungry beast tonight." Miller snorted, a dry, hacking sound. "Don't tell them about the singing. They'll think it's a trick, or they'll hope too hard." He struck a match against the bed frame, the flare illuminating the hollows of his cheeks for a second before dying. "My sister thinks I'm in a convalescent home in Brighton. Let her keep thinking it. Truth doesn't fill the larder, Tom. It just empties the heart." Thomas looked back at his letter. The workshop is silent. It wasn't true. The silence was just the pause before the breath. He crossed out the word silent and wrote resting, a subtle shift, a hedge against the morning. "The elf is tired," he continued, the ink flowing smoother now. "He has asked the lion to rest its head. They are sharing a fire in the snow. I can hear them talking, low voices, singing old songs. It sounds like the hymns Mum used to sing in Bethnal Green before the cold dust took the color from the walls." He paused, listening. Through the double-glazed window, faint and muffled by the distance and the cold, came the sound. A chorus, "Stille Nacht." Then, answering it, "Silent Night." The voices blended, rising and falling in the frozen air, a strange, haunting harmony that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. It was beautiful. It was terrible. It sounded like a funeral dirge for the world they knew. "They're singing, 'O come, all ye faithful now,'" Miller whispered, closing his eyes. "My mother loved that one, said it was the only thing that made the cold bearable." Thomas watched him. Miller's chest rose and fell in a shallow rhythm, the movement of a man saving energy for a battle he couldn't fight. The singing swelled, filling the ward, pushing back the shadows for a moment. It was a temporary reprieve, a crack in the armor of the war. But Thomas knew the physics of this place. Energy was conserved. The silence would be paid for with noise later. The peace would be bought with blood tomorrow. He needed to tell Elsie, not the truth, but the code, the thing that would let her know he understood the cost. He added a verse to the letter, a modification of the carol drifting through the window. "And the stars looked down on the workshop floor," he wrote, the letters tightening as his grip on the pen strengthened. "Frozen bright above the snow, they saw the elf and the lion shake hands. But the stars know the secret, Elsie. They know the ice is thin. They know the mud waits beneath." He underlined "frozen stars" twice, a signal, a warning. If the truce held, it was a miracle. If it broke, it was the natural order. Either way, the stars remained, cold, distant, uncaring witnesses to the carnage. "Tom," Miller opened one eye, "you all right? You're staring at that paper like it's going to bite you." "Just thinking," Thomas said, capping the pen, "about what comes next." "Nothing comes next," Miller muttered, turning onto his side. "Not tonight. Tonight is enough. Don't spoil it with tomorrow." Thomas nodded, though he knew Miller was wrong. Tomorrow was already here, waiting in the wings, sharpening its knives. He folded the letter, the paper crackling loudly in the quiet room. He slipped it into an envelope, addressing it to Woolwich, to the factory, to the sister who was likely filling shells while he wrote of peace. The irony sat heavy in his gut, a stone he couldn't digest. He placed the envelope on the bedside table, next to the glass of water and the small tin of morphine tablets. The singing outside was fading now, the voices growing hoarse, the spell weakening. The wind picked up, whistling through the cracks in the window frame, a low, mournful sound that chilled the room. Boxing Day, Thomas whispered to himself. The date hung in the air, ominous. He reached for a fresh sheet of paper. He couldn't send the letter yet, not until he knew. He had to wait, had to see if the sun rose on a battlefield or a graveyard. He dipped the pen again, ready to add a postscript if the guns spoke before the postman arrived. The silence stretched, thin and brittle. A clock on the wall ticked, counting down the seconds until the treaty expired. Tick, tick, tick. Thomas watched the window. The snow outside seemed to shimmer, reflecting the faint glow of a flare that drifted up from the trenches, painting the clouds a sickly red. The lion was stirring. The elf was waking. He waited. The pen hovered over the paper, a loaded gun in his hand. The smell hit first. Not cordite, not the usual sharp sting of sulfur that coated the back of the throat and turned spit yellow, but something sweeter, cloying, like rotting lilies left too long in a warm room. It came from the girl on the next bench. Mary, 17, by the look of her, though her eyes were older, hollowed out by the news that had arrived with the Morning Post. Her brother gone at lose. Just a line in a telegram, no body, no grave, just a notification that the state had taken its due. Mary's hands shook. The brass casing slipped, clattered onto the concrete floor, rolling under the press. She didn't move to retrieve it. She just stared at the machine, at the rammer that waited, heavy and oily, ready to pack the explosive charge into the shell casing with a force that could shear a finger clean off if the timing was wrong. "Pick it up," Foreman Holloway barked, his voice cutting through the drone of the ventilation fans. He didn't look up from his clipboard. "Waste is treason, girl, you know the order." Mary flinched. Her fingers twitched but didn't reach down. The tremor ran up her arms, visible even through the coarse wool of her overall sleeves. She was going to freeze. Everyone saw it. The moment the mind breaks and the body follows, locking up like a seized engine. If she froze, Holloway would send her home without pay. Or worse, he'd report her for malingering and the police would come. The essential work order didn't care about grief. It cared about output. Elsie stepped forward. The movement cost her. Her own legs felt leaden, the TNT dust embedded in her pores making her skin itch with a deep, burning heat that no amount of scrubbing could remove. She had worked the day shift, 12 hours on her feet, and the night shift was supposed to be for the fresh crew. But Mary was shaking like a leaf in a gale, and if Mary made a mistake, the whole bay would go up. "I'll take her place," Elsie said. Her voice sounded flat, distant, as if spoken by someone else. Holloway looked up then, his eyes narrowing behind his wire-rimmed spectacles. "You've done your time, Penhaligon, go home." "Mary needs to go home," Elsie countered, keeping her tone level, devoid of challenge. "She's no use to you like this. She'll jam the press, or worse, I'm already here, I know the rhythm." She didn't wait for permission. She moved to Mary's side, placed a firm hand on the girl's shoulder. The fabric of Mary's overall was damp with sweat despite the chill in the hall. "Go on," Elsie murmured, steering her away from the machine. "Get your coat. Tell them I sent you. Tell them the elf needed you for a special delivery." Mary blinked, confusion cutting through the shock. "The what?" "The elf," Elsie repeated, the code slipping out automatically, a reflex born of too many letters written in the dark. "He's short-handed tonight. The stars need polishing. Go on before Holloway changes his mind." She pushed Mary towards the clocking-out station, ignoring the foreman's grunt of irritation. It didn't matter. The quota had to be met, and Elsie knew the machine better than most. She knew how to listen to the hiss of the hydraulic press, how to feel the vibration in the soles of her boots that signaled a misfire before it happened. She slid onto the stool, the wood warm from Mary's body heat, and picked up the fallen casing. It was cold, heavy, smelling of oil and potential death. Thud, pack, thud. The rhythm resumed. Elsie drove the rammer down, her muscles burning, the repetitive motion a kind of prayer. She wasn't just filling shells, she was buying time. Time for Mary to escape. Time for the war to end. Time for Thomas to come home. But the cost was piling up. She could feel it in the ache of her joints, in the yellow tinge that had spread from her fingertips to her wrists, a stain that no soap could touch. The toxin was working its way into her blood, slow and steady, turning her into something less than human, something made of powder and fire. She reached for a scrap of paper tucked into her apron pocket. A pencil stub, blunt and worn, she had to write. Not to the censor, not to the authorities, but to Thomas. He would understand. He had to. Dear Tom, she scribbled, the handwriting jagged in the dim light of the overhead bulb. The workshop is busier than expected. The elf has called for extra hands tonight. The stars are dull, covered in soot, and he says they won't shine unless we polish them ourselves. I volunteered. It seems only fair. Someone has to keep the light burning while the lion sleeps. Don't worry about me. The cold doesn't bite as hard when you're moving. She paused, the pencil hovering over the paper. It was a lie. The cold bit deep, settling in her bones, making her teeth chatter despite the heat radiating from the machinery. But she couldn't tell him the truth. She couldn't write about the fear that coiled in her gut every time she packed the cordite, the knowledge that one spark, one slip, would turn her into nothing more than a memory and a pile of rubble. And she certainly couldn't mention the yellow skin, the creeping poison that marked her as a sacrifice to the war effort. Tell Mum and Dad I'm eating well, she added, the words tasting like ash. The elf provides plenty of provisions, and tell them the wardrobe is still locked, safe, no one gets in. She folded the note, tucking it into an envelope she'd saved from last week's post. It wouldn't go out tonight. The post box was locked, the collection already done. It would have to wait until morning, by which time the censor might have had his coffee and be in a generous mood, or he might not. It was a gamble, everything was a gamble now. A crack echoed through the room, sharp, sudden, like a pistol shot. Elsie flinched, dropping the pencil. The other women looked up, eyes wide, sweeping their gazes across the rafters for falling debris, checking the presses for rupture. But the sound hadn't come from the machinery, it had come from somewhere else, somewhere distant. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She knew that sound, not the sound of breaking glass or splintering wood, but the sound of something fundamental giving way, a fracture in the world. She thought of the mantelpiece in Bethnal Green, the photograph of the family taken last summer before the war took hold, before Thomas went to France and she came to Woolwich. They were all smiling in it, standing in the garden, the hollyhocks tall behind them. A perfect moment, frozen in silver salts and paper. If the myth was holding, if the lie was working, the photograph should remain intact. But the physics of their arrangement were cruel. Every time they used the story to shield their parents from the horror, something in the real world degraded. A cup chipped, a rug frayed, a picture cracked. The crack she had heard wasn't in the factory. It was in the house, miles away. The glass over the photograph had shattered, or the frame had split, or the image itself had faded, the faces blurring into obscurity. Elsie stared at the shell casing in her hand. It was cold now, inert, but it held enough power to level a street, enough power to kill hundreds. She was making this. Her hands, stained yellow and trembling with fatigue, were crafting the instruments of destruction while she wrote lies about elves and stars. Penhaligon, Holloway's voice snapped her back. Stop dreaming and work. The quota won't fill itself. Yes, sir, she muttered, picking up the rammer again. Thud, pack, thud. The rhythm swallowed her. She worked mechanically, her mind drifting back to the house in Bethnal Green. She could see her mother sitting by the fire, knitting needles clicking softly. Her father, reading the paper, pretending not to worry. And on the mantel, the photograph, cracked, broken, a visible sign of the invisible damage they were inflicting on themselves. It was too much. The cost was becoming too high. The workshop of frozen stars was collapsing under the weight of the truth it was trying to hide. Soon, there would be nothing left to shield them. Soon, the raw trauma would flood the house, sweeping away the fragile comfort of the myths. But not tonight. Tonight she had to keep working. Tonight she had to keep the lie alive, for Mary, for Thomas, for the parents who still believed their children were safe in the care of a jolly old elf. Elsie drove the rammer down again, harder this time, putting all her fear, all her anger, all her desperate love into the motion. The brass casing accepted the charge, sealing it tight. Another shell for the front, another piece of the puzzle that was slowly destroying them all. She reached for the next casing, and the next. The pile grew, a mountain of steel and death, while she whispered silent prayers to a god she wasn't sure was listening. The stars need polishing, she thought, the words looping in her mind like a broken record. The stars need polishing. Outside, the police whistles began to wail. A Zeppelin raid. The all clear hadn't even sounded from the last one. The war was coming home, roaring like a lion unleashed, and there was no wardrobe big enough to hide from it. Elsie didn't stop working. She couldn't. The shift wasn't over, the quota wasn't met, and the elf was still watching. She picked up the pencil again, adding a final line to the letter she wouldn't send until morning. If the snow melts, Tom, don't look for me in the garden. I'll be here, in the workshop, keeping the light on. She sealed the envelope, her fingers leaving a greasy smudge on the white paper, a mark of her trade, a mark of her sacrifice. The police whistles grew louder, drowning out the hum of the machines. The lights flickered, then steadied. Elsie drove the rammer down. Thud! The sound echoed in the vast hall, a solitary beat in the symphony of destruction. The whistle shrieked, a thin, tearing sound that sliced through the heavy, sulphur-thick air of the filling shed. Mary flinched, her shoulders hunching up towards her ears as if expecting a blow, the small tin lunchbox in her hand rattling against her thigh. She looked pale, the skin beneath the grime translucent and waxy, eyes darting towards the clock on the far wall which ticked with a sluggish, indifferent rhythm. Her brother had gone down at Lou's 3 weeks prior, a fact the factory foreman had announced, with the same dull monotone used to request extra rags for the polishing wheels. And since then, the girl had been working with a tremor in her hands that made the delicate task of seating fuses a danger to us all. One slip, one spark from a dropped tool, and the entire bay would vanish in a flash of orange heat, leaving nothing but a crater and a smudge of soot on the brickwork. "Go home, Mary," Elsie said, keeping her voice low, barely audible over the distant thump of the hydraulic presses. "Tell Holloway your head's spinning, the fumes." Mary shook her head, a jerky, bird-like motion. "Can't, need the shilling, Mum needs the coal." "I'll cover your count," Elsie insisted, stepping closer, blocking the girl from the foreman's line of sight. She could smell the cordite on Mary's clothes, a sharp, acrid scent that clung to the hair and skin, mingling with the stale sweat of fear. "Take the night off. Go sit by the fire. Tell them the elf sent you early, that the stars are polished enough for one evening." Mary looked at her, eyes wide and wet, the gratitude twisting her face into something painful to witness. "You do the double. It's 12 hours, Els. The yellow gets in your lungs." "Let it," Elsie muttered, turning her back before the girl could see the tightness in her jaw, the way her own hands were trembling now, not from fear, but from the sheer effort of holding herself together. "Go on, before Holloway sees you standing about. Tell him I volunteered. Tell him the workshop needs extra hands tonight." Mary hesitated, then nodded, clutching her box tighter as she scurried towards the exit, her footsteps echoing on the concrete floor until the heavy iron door clanged shut behind her. Silence rushed in to fill the gap, heavy and oppressive, broken only by the rhythmic clunk hiss of the machinery and the scratch of Elsie's pencil as she added a postscript to the letter tucked inside her apron pocket. "The elf requires assistance," she wrote, the graphite leaving a dark, jagged line on the cheap paper. "The frost is deep in the grotto, and the stars are dull without enough polish. I shall stay until the shift bell rings twice." She folded the note, tucking it away beside the other, the one she had written earlier about the cracked photograph, the one she knew she could never post. To send it would be to admit the myth was failing, to tell Thomas that the cost of their lies was eating the house in Bethnal Green from the inside out, cracking the glass over their mother's smiling face while they pretended everything was safe. It was a transaction, brutal and absolute. Every lie they told to protect their parents chipped away a piece of the real world, and now the bill was coming due. Miles away in the sterile, carbolic-scented ward of the 3rd London General, Thomas sat on the edge of his cot, the rough wool blanket bunched in his lap. The order lay on the bedside table, a crisp piece of official stationery that seemed to burn his eyes whenever he glanced at it. "Proceed to Folkestone. Report to Embarkation Depot. 800 hours, 23rd December. The ink was black, definitive, allowing no room for appeal or delay. He was fit for service again, or at least fit enough to be sent back into the mud, his legs stiff but bearing weight, the scar tissue pulling tight when the cold damp of the English winter settled in his bones. He picked up his pen, the nib scratchy and dry, and dipped it into the small pot of ink he had salvaged from the nurse's station. The paper before him was blank, waiting for the words that would say goodbye without actually saying the word. He could not write "I am going to die," for the censor would slash those lines with a red pencil, confiscate the letter, and leave his parents with nothing but silence. Instead, he had to speak in codes, in the language of the workshop, where death was a journey, and the front was a frozen landscape ruled by a capricious king. He stopped staring at the words. They looked innocent enough, a childish fancy suitable for a brother playing along with his sister's games, but beneath the surface lay the cold, hard truth of the deployment orders. If he did not return, if the Lion King roared too loud in the trenches of France, this letter would be the last thing they had from him. It was a will disguised as a bedtime story, a set of instructions on how to grieve without knowing they were grieving. "If the snow never melts," he continued, the pen scratching harder now, leaving deep indentations in the paper, "do not worry about the presents. The most important thing is to keep the fire lit in the hearth, keep the kettle on, and remember that the wardrobe is locked for a reason. Do not open it, no matter how much you wonder what is inside." A nurse walked past the end of his bed, her shoes squeaking softly on the linoleum, carrying a tray of bandages and bottles of iodine. She glanced at him, her expression neutral, professional, seeing only a soldier writing a letter home, not a man composing his own epitaph. Thomas waited until she had turned the corner before continuing, his handwriting becoming slightly more jagged, the pressure of the pen increasing. "Tell Elsie I am glad she is helping with the stars. Tell her the light in the workshop is the only thing that keeps the cold out. And tell her that if I do not come back from the North Pole, she must be the one to keep the story alive. For you, for everyone." He blew on the ink to dry it, the scent of the chemical sharp in his nostrils, mixing with the lingering smell of antiseptic and old sweat that permeated the ward. Outside, the sky was dark, the stars hidden behind a layer of thick grey cloud that promised snow before morning. The train to Folkestone would leave at dawn, chugging through the countryside, carrying him back to the place where the mud sucked at your boots and the air tasted of copper and rot. He folded the letter, tucking it into an envelope he had saved, sealing the flap with a dab of glue from the communal pot. On the front, he did not write the address. Instead, in small, precise letters, he wrote, "Open only if the snow never melts." He held the envelope for a moment, feeling the weight of it in his hand, the thinness of the paper bellying the heaviness of the words inside. This could not go in the post. The censor would see the lack of address, the cryptic warning, and detain it immediately. It had to be kept safe, hidden away until it was needed, or perhaps forever. He looked around the ward, his eyes settling on Sister Cavell, who was checking the charts at the nurse's station. She was a woman of quiet strength, her face lined with the fatigue of long shifts and too many losses, but her eyes were kind, holding a depth of understanding that suggested she knew more than she ever said. Thomas stood up, his leg protesting with a sharp twinge of pain that he ignored, and walked over to the station. The floor was cold beneath his thin socks, the chill rising up through his bones. "Sister," he said, his voice rough from disuse. She looked up, adjusting her spectacles. "Penhaligon, you should be resting, orders come through." "Yes," he replied, holding out the envelope. "I have a document, for my family, in case something happens on the journey." Cavell looked at the envelope, then at his face, her gaze steady and unflinching. She did not ask what was inside. She did not need to. In this place, everyone carried secrets they could not speak aloud, truths that had to be wrapped in metaphor to survive the scrutiny of the authorities. She reached out, her fingers cool and dry, and took the envelope from him. "I will keep it," she said softly, tucking it into the pocket of her uniform next to her own heart. "Safe, like the wardrobe." Thomas nodded, a lump forming in his throat that he forced down with a swallow. "Thank you." He turned back to his bed, the movement stiff and deliberate. The ward was quiet now, the other men asleep or lost in their own private thoughts. The only sound the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall, marking the seconds until dawn, until the train, until the end of the stay in this fragile, temporary safety. He sat down, staring at his hands, wondering if Elsie felt the same crack in the world that he did, the same sense of the ground shifting beneath their feet as the myth began to crumble under the weight of the reality they were trying to outrun. The snow was coming, and this time there might be no spring to follow. The glass gave way with a sound like a dry twig snapping under a heavy boot, a sharp, decisive crack that cut through the low hum of the gas mantle and the distant rumble of a bus on the main road. Elsie froze, the tin mug of tea halfway to her lips, her eyes fixed on the mantelpiece where the family stood frozen in silver bromide. The fracture ran diagonally from the top right corner, slicing straight through father's cap and the brim of mother's Sunday hat, stopping just short of Thomas's smiling face, as if the break itself had decided who was worth saving and who was already lost. She set the mug down on the scrubbed pine table, the ceramic ringing against the wood, and walked over to inspect the damage, her heart hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm against her ribs that had nothing to do with the shock of the noise. It wasn't a hit. No bomb had fallen on Bethnal Green tonight, no Zeppelin had dropped its payload of high explosives on their street, and yet the frame had split, the wood behind the glass warping slightly as though subjected to a heat that hadn't touched the room. She reached out, her finger hovering over the jagged line, afraid that touching it might cause the whole thing to shatter into dust, leaving them with nothing but a pile of splinters and a memory of a summer day in 1912 that now felt like a lifetime ago. The workshop was leaking. The cost of keeping the lies alive, of weaving stories about elves and frozen stars to shield their parents from the truth of the mud and the cordite, was finally coming due, and it was taking pieces of the house with it. Elsie, mother's voice came from the armchair, thick with the drowsiness of someone who had been knitting by the fire for too long. Did something fall, love? Elsie pulled her hand back, wiping her palm on her apron as if to remove the evidence of the crack, forcing her voice into a lightness she did not feel. Just the frame settling, Mum. Old wood expands when the fire's up. Nothing to worry about. Ah, Mother murmured, returning her attention to the sock she was darning, the needles clicking a steady, oblivious rhythm. Must be the damp. It gets into everything these days. It wasn't the damp. Elsie knew it with a certainty that sat cold and heavy in her stomach, a physical weight that made it hard to draw breath. Every time they successfully used the myth to shield their parents from a specific horror, something tangible degraded. A chipped teacup, a frayed hearth rug, and now this. The photograph was the anchor of their reality, the proof that they were whole, that they existed as a unit. And now it was broken, a visual representation of the fracture spreading through their lives. She looked at Thomas's face in the picture, the way he squinted slightly against the sun, unaware that in a few hours he would be on a train to Folkestone, heading back to the place where the ground chewed men up and spat them out as names on a list. She turned away from the mantel, walking to the small desk in the corner where she kept her writing paper, the inkwell already open, the pen resting on a blotter stained with previous attempts to say what could not be said. She sat down, the chair creaking under her weight, and picked up the pen, the metal cool against her fingers. She had to write to him. She had to tell him about the crack, but she couldn't say it directly. If she wrote the frame broke, the censor might see it as a sign of domestic instability, a morale-damaging detail that suggested the home front was crumbling and the letter would be detained. She had to use the code. They had to speak in the language of the workshop, where broken glass was just another star that had fallen from the ceiling. Dear Tom, she wrote, the nib scratching across the paper, leaving a trail of black ink that looked too dark, too final. The elf has been working hard tonight. Too hard, perhaps. He needed extra hands to polish the stars, so I volunteered for the night shift at the factory. There was a girl younger than me whose brother was killed last week. She couldn't hold the rammer, her hands were shaking so much. So I took her place, told the foreman the elf sent me. He just nodded. They don't ask questions when the quotas are high. She paused, dipping the pen again, the ink welling up around the nib, threatening to drip. How to tell him about the photograph, how to say that the protection was failing without causing him to panic, to do something reckless. The workshop is getting cold, Tom, colder than usual. We found a crack in the ice today, right across the window where we watch for the reindeer. I didn't tell Mum and Dad. They think it's just the weather. But you and I know better. The frost is spreading, it's reaching inside. She stopped, staring at the words. The frost is spreading. It was a warning, but it was also a confession. They were running out of time, out of metaphors, out of ways to keep the horror at bay. The physical world was reclaiming what they had tried to hide, and the cost was becoming too high to sustain. She looked over at her parents, sitting by the fire, oblivious to the fact that their daughter was turning yellow from the TNT, that their son was being sent back to the slaughter, that their home was slowly disintegrating around them. They were safe in their ignorance, protected by the very lies that were destroying them. "Keep the fire lit," she continued, her handwriting becoming more urgent, the letters sloping forward as if running to catch up with her thoughts. "Don't let the ice get to the hearth. If the workshop freezes over completely, we won't be able to find our way back. I'll keep polishing the stars. You just keep walking, don't stop for anything, not even for the king." She blew on the ink, watching it dry, the scent of the chemical sharp and acrid in the air. Outside, the street was quiet, the blackout curtains drawn tight against the possibility of a raid, but she could feel the tension in the air, the waiting, the sense that something was about to break. Just like the frame, just like them. She folded the letter, tucking it into an envelope, sealing it with wax from a candle stub she kept in the drawer. She didn't have a stamp, but she would buy one in the morning, first thing, before the shift started. She had to get this to him before he left. It was the only way to let him know that she knew, that she saw the crack, and that she was still standing, still holding the line, even as the ground beneath them gave way. She placed the envelope on the table, next to the mug of tea that had gone cold, and stood up, stretching her stiff back. The night shift awaited. The stars needed polishing, and the workshop, fragile and failing, needed them both to keep the story alive, no matter the cost. She walked to the door, pausing to look back at the cracked photograph one last time, the fracture seeming to deepen in the dim light, a silent testament to the price of their survival. Then she turned, opened the door, and stepped out into the cold London night, leaving the broken image behind her. The carriage wheel hit a gap in the track, and the ink jumped, a black spider skittering across the page to drown in the grain of the wood. I cursed, thumb rubbing the smear, until it bloomed into a grey cloud, useless now, another word lost to the journey. Outside the window, Kent unspooled in a blur of mud and stubble, the fields stripped bare by winter, and the hunger of men who needed firewood more than they needed fences, and I pressed my forehead against the cold glass to steady the shaking in my hand, knowing that if I stopped writing now, if I let the pen rest on the knee of my tunic, where the fabric was worn thin from the hospital sheets, I might never pick it up again. "Ticket, mate." The conductor stood in the aisle, a silhouette cut from the dim light of the oil lamp swinging above, his hand outstretched, palm grey with cold dust. I fumbled in my pocket, fingers numb, the paper crumpled from being folded and unfolded a dozen times since we left Victoria, and handed it over without looking up, because looking up meant seeing the other boys in the compartment, the ones with the fresh bandages and the 1,000-yard stares that weren't looking at anything in this carriage at all. He punched the card, the snap of the pliers loud as a rifle bolt in the quiet, and moved on, his boots clumping heavily on the floorboards, leaving behind the smell of wet wool and stale tobacco that clung to every uniform in the army. I dipped the pen again, the nib scratching against the cheap paper, the sound like a mouse gnawing at the wall of a house that was already falling down. "Dear Elsie," I wrote, the letters jagged, fighting the sway of the train. "The lion is roaring louder now, not the king in London, but the other one, the one with the iron teeth. We are going to feed him soon." I stopped. Too direct. If the censor at Folkestone saw "feed him," if he saw iron teeth, the letter would vanish into the sack marked rejected, and Elsie would receive nothing but an envelope with a red stamp, and she would know. She would know I was scared. I scratched out the line with a heavy crosshatch, the ink soaking through to the other side, ruining the next sentence before I had even written it. "Damn." The train lurched, throwing me against the seat, my bad leg throbbing where the shrapnel had taken the muscle, a dull, rhythmic ache that matched the clatter of the wheels, a constant reminder that I was broken, that I was going back to the place that broke me, and the fear rose up in my throat, hot and acidic, tasting of the morphine they had given me at the station. I had to tell her. Not about the lion. Not about the workshop. Just the truth, for once, before the static took over. The landscape is blurring, Els. It looks like white static, like the snow we used to dream of when the frost was on the inside of the window. I am afraid. There, I have written it. I am afraid that this time the elf will not be able to fix the stars, that the workshop is too far gone. My hand trembled, the pen hovering over the paper, the ink gathering at the tip, a perfect, dark sphere ready to fall and ruin everything. A boy across from me, no older than 16, with a bandage wrapped around his head that was already staining brown, looked up. "You writing to your girl?" he asked, his voice rough, like he hadn't used it in days. "Sister," I said, not looking at him, focusing on the drop of ink, willing it to stay put. "Tell her I'm all right," he said, turning back to the window, watching the telegraph poles flash by like the bars of a cage. "Tell them all we're all right, don't want them worrying." I nodded, though he couldn't see it. That was the rule. Don't want them worrying. Lie. Always lie. I wiped the nib on my trouser leg, the fabric rough against the metal, and started again, forcing the handwriting to smooth out, to look like the brother who could fix things, the one who knew how to talk to the elf. But the elf is strong, Elsie, stronger than the frost. He has a new plan, a big one. He is gathering all the stars, even the ones that have fallen, and he is going to make a new light, a light so bright it will melt the ice. You must keep the fire lit. Do not let it go out, no matter how cold it gets. I will be there soon to help him, I promise. The lie tasted like copper. The train began to slow, the brakes squealing, a high-pitched cry that set my teeth on edge, and I knew we were approaching the junction, the last stop before the coast, before the boats, before the channel. Time was running out. I had to finish. I had to say goodbye without saying it. If the letter stops, if you don't hear from me, know that the workshop is just closed for the season. The elf is resting. He needs rest. We all do. Look after Mum and Dad. Tell them the snow is beautiful this year. Tell Thema. The whistle blew. A sharp, tearing sound that ripped through the carriage, drowning out my thoughts, and the train jerked violently, throwing everyone forward. My pen slipped. A long, jagged line tore across the bottom of the page, cutting through the word them, slashing the paper, a wound that couldn't be stitched. I gripped the seat, bracing myself, the letter sliding from my knee to the floor, landing in the dirt and cold dust beneath the bench. I reached for it, but the train picked up speed, the momentum pinning me back, and I watched the paper disappear into the shadows under the seat, gone, lost in the dark. I sat there, hands still outstretched, fingers curling around nothing, the empty page in my lap staring back at me, blank now, except for the tear where the pen had slipped. Outside, the lights of Folkestone appeared, a cluster of yellow eyes in the gloom, waiting. I picked up the pen again, but there was no ink left. Just the dry scratch of metal on paper, a sound like bones rubbing together. I closed my eyes and listened to the wheels, counting the beats, waiting for the end of the line. The sulfur clung to the cuticles, a yellow stain that no amount of scrubbing with pumice soap could shift, settling into the ridges of her fingerprints like pollen from a poisonous flower. Elsie sat at the dresser, the wood cold against her elbows, writing by the light of a single candle stub that guttered in the draught from the window frame. Outside, the street lay swallowed by the blackout, a void so complete the neighbors' houses might have been torn down, leaving only the smell of wet coal and the distant thump of anti-aircraft guns over the river to prove the city still stood. She pressed the nib harder, the metal biting into the cheap paper, leaving an indentation on the sheet beneath as she wrote the things she could not say aloud. My hands are yellow, Tom, proper canary yellow. The foreman says it is the dust, that it will wash off when the work stops, but the work does not stop. It piles up. The shells weight like iron mountains, and we fill them until our lungs taste of cordate. She paused, lifting the pen to wipe a smudge of ink from her thumb, the stain there darker than the rest, a permanent mark of the trade. On the dresser beside the inkwell stood the photograph of the family taken at Easter, the cardboard mount beginning to peel at the corners, a hairline crack running through the image of their mother's face, splitting the smile in two. The picture is cracking. I noticed it this morning. It looks as though the glass is tired of holding the image together. I am tired too. I think if I sleep, I might not wake up, and if I wake, I might not stop shaking. A heavy knock rattled the door, 3 sharp blasts that shook the frame and made the candle flame dance wildly, casting long, jerking shadows against the wallpaper. "Miss Penhaligon." The voice was muffled through the wood, rough and authoritative, belonging to the warden who patrolled the terrace with his armband and his whistle. "Put that light out, you are showing a chink." Elsie froze, the pen hovering over the word shaking. "It is covered," she called back, her voice thin, lacking the strength to argue, lacking the will to stand up and check the curtain herself. "I can see it from the pavement. Do you want a bomb dropped on us all?" "It is covered," she repeated, louder this time, reaching out to cup her hands around the flame, shielding it from the glass, shielding the room from the street. "See that it stays so, next time I report it." Footsteps heavy with hobnailed boots clumped away down the passage, fading into the dark, leaving the silence to rush back in, heavier than before. She waited until the sound vanished completely before exhaling, a long, shuddering breath that emptied her lungs of the stale air. Reading the words on the page, the confession looked like a surrender. If this letter went in the post, if Mum held this paper and saw the word tired written in her daughter's hand, saw the description of the yellow skin and the cracking glass, she would not sleep again. She would sit by the window waiting for the knock that would bring the telegram, watching the postman until her eyes went red, believing that the yellow skin was the first sign of death, that the cracking photo was an omen. Thomas had written of the elf. He had written of the workshop. He had built a castle of words to keep the wolves out, and here she was, digging a gate in the wall to let them in. She looked at her hands, turning them over in the dim light, the yellow palms looking like wax models of hands, not flesh, not hers. No. She reached for a fresh sheet of paper, the surface clean and blank, waiting for a lie that would keep them warm. The candles sputtered, a drop of hot wax falling onto the table, hardening instantly into a white tear. "Dear Tom," she wrote, the script looping and careful, forcing the tremor out of the letters. "The workshop is warm tonight. The elf has lit the fire in the forge, and the stars are polishing up nicely. He says the frost is keeping the bad things away." She stopped, dipping the pen, the ink well nearly dry, scraping the bottom for the last dregs. "Do not worry about the photo. It is just the damp. Mum is well. Dad is sleeping. We are all waiting for the spring." It was thin. It was paper thin. But it would hold. She blew on the wet ink, watching the sheen disappear as the words dried, locking the lie into the fiber. Folding the false letter, she slid it into the envelope, sealing the flap with a lick of glue that tasted of chemicals and starch, then placed it aside on the stack ready for the morning post. The other letter, the one with the yellow hands and the cracking glass, remained on the dresser. She did not burn it. Burning it would feel like destroying evidence, like pretending the pain had not happened, and she was not ready to pretend that much. She picked up the unsent page, the paper heavy with the truth, and placed it under the photograph, sliding it beneath the frame so only the edge showed, a white border around the family's smiles. "There, hidden but kept. Safe." She stood up, her knees clicking, the stiffness in her joints reminding her of the long shifts standing at the filling benches, the repetitive motion of lifting the shells, lifting the funnels, lifting the weight of the war. Walking to the window, she peeked through the gap in the blackout cloth, seeing nothing but the black void, feeling the glass cold against her forehead. Somewhere out there, Thomas was on the train. Somewhere out there, the lion was roaring. And here she was, standing in the dark, holding the line between the truth that killed and the lie that lived. She turned back to the room, the candle guttering low, the wax pooling around the base. Tomorrow the postman would come. He would take the lie away. He would leave the truth behind. She reached out and snuffed the wick with her fingers, the smell of burnt cotton rising in the dark, marking the end of the day, marking the start of the waiting. The carriage jolted, a sharp metallic clang that threw Thomas forward until his shoulder slammed against the wooden slat of the seat opposite. His pen skidded across the page, tearing a jagged furrow through the word dear, the ink blooming into a dark, wet star that swallowed the letter R entirely. He gripped the notebook tighter, knuckles white, the leather cover slick with the sweat of his palm, trying to anchor himself against the rhythmic pounding of the wheels on the track. Outside, the Kentish landscape blurred into a smear of grey and brown, the hedgerows rushing past like fleeing spectators, their branches stripped bare by the November wind that howled along the platform edges before the train even stopped. Folkestone was coming. He could feel it in the change of the air, the salt creeping through the gaps in the window frame, mixing with the smell of coal smoke and the stale, sour odor of unwashed uniforms that hung heavy in the compartment. 3 other men sat with him, RAMC orderlies like himself, their heads lolling against the glass, eyes shut, feigning sleep to avoid the conversation that waited at the end of the line. One of them, a boy named Miller who could not have been more than 19, was chewing on a fingernail, the sound a soft, wet click that echoed in the pauses between the rail joints. Thomas looked down at his letter. My dearest Elsie. The words seemed insufficient, brittle things that might shatter if spoken aloud, let alone posted across the channel to a world that felt increasingly distant with every mile of track consumed by the engine. He had promised her the workshop. He had promised her the elf. But the train was shaking the lies loose, rattling them out of his pockets until all that remained was the cold, hard truth of the deployment orders burning a hole in his tunic pocket. The journey is long, he wrote, the pen scratching against the rough paper, the nib catching on the fibers. The fields are white with frost, or perhaps it is just the light. It is hard to tell the difference when the world moves this fast. He paused, lifting the pen, watching a droplet of ink swell at the tip, trembling, ready to fall. This was the last time. He knew it with a certainty that sat heavy in his gut, a stone-swallowed hole that would never digest, never pass, just sit there turning cold. The medical board had been clear, their faces masks of bureaucratic indifference as they signed the chit that sent him back to the mud, back to the stretchers, back to the screaming men who needed carrying when the legs were gone. They had called it duty. They had called it service. He called it a sentence. He did not know how it was. He knew that letters went missing. He knew that men went missing. He knew that the workshop of frozen stars was a fragile thing, built on paper and hope, and that the Lion King was not a storybook beast, but a real, roaring monster that ate boys named Miller and men named Thomas without chewing. Miller stopped chewing his nail. He opened his eyes, looking at Thomas, the pupils dilated in the gloom of the carriage, reflecting the faint grey light filtering through the dirty glass. Are we there? Miller asked, his voice cracking, a boy's voice trying to wear a man's uniform. Not yet, Thomas said, not looking up, focusing on the next line, the next lie, the next shield he could build for his sister. Just Folkestone, then the boat. The boat, Miller repeated, the word sounding foreign, dangerous, like a curse spoken in a church. Thomas ignored him, pressing the pen harder, forcing the ink to flow, to fill the page before the courage ran out, before the train stopped and the doors opened and the real world rushed in to claim them. The elf is busy, he wrote, the words tumbling out now, a desperate incantation against the fear that threatened to freeze his hand. He is polishing the stars for Christmas. He says the frost is necessary. He says it keeps the machinery clean. It was nonsense. It was beautiful, terrible nonsense. Elsie would understand. She would read the code, the desperation hidden in the mention of the frost, the way the machinery needed cleaning, and she would know that he was scared, that he was going back into the fire, that he might not come out whole. Or she would not. She might just read the words and smile, thinking of a jolly old man in a red suit, thinking of gifts and carols, thinking of anything but the gas and the guns and the mud that sucked at your boots until you were too tired to lift them again. He wanted her to know. He wanted her to be safe in her ignorance. The conflict tore at him, a physical ache in his chest that had nothing to do with the shrapnel scar that pulled at his side when the train lurched. The carriage swayed violently, throwing him against the window, the glass cold against his temple, shocking him into a moment of absolute crystalline clarity. He looked at the page. The ink was still wet, glistening in the dim light. "I am afraid, Elsie," he thought, the words forming in his mind with perfect, devastating simplicity. "I am so afraid that I cannot breathe." He moved the pen to the paper. He wrote "I am." The train whistles screamed. It was a high, piercing sound that cut through the rumble of the wheels, a signal of arrival, of departure, of the end of the journey and the start of the war. Miller flinched, dropping his hand, the nail-biting forgotten. "Here we go," Miller whispered, the words barely audible over the shriek of the brakes as the wheels began to slow, the screech of metal on metal filling the compartment, drowning out thought, drowning out voice. Thomas looked at the half-written sentence. "I am." The pen hovered. The train jerked to a halt, the sudden stop throwing everyone forward again, the momentum breaking the line of his arm, the pen lifting from the page as he grabbed the seat to steady himself. The door flew open. "Out, out, move it." The sergeant's voice boomed, harsh and impatient, brooking no delay, no hesitation, no final words. Thomas looked at the paper one last time. The ink on AM was beginning to dry, a small, black island in a sea of white. He could finish it. He could write afraid. He could write goodbye. The sergeant grabbed his shoulder, fingers digging into the wool of his tunic, yanking him towards the door, towards the platform, towards the boat, towards the front. "Move, Penhaligon, no time for scribbling." The book was snatched from his lap, the pages fluttering, the unfinished sentence exposed to the cold air of the station, to the shouting men, to the chaos of the embarkation. He stumbled onto the platform, the gravel crunching under his boots, the notebook clutched tight against his chest, the pen still in his hand, the ink smearing across his thumb. He tried to speak. He tried to say the words. But the whistle blew again, louder this time, a final, mournful cry that drowned out his voice, that drowned out the truth, that left the sentence hanging in the air, incomplete, unfinished, forever suspended between the fear and the silence. "I am." The words trailed off, lost in the noise of the departure, the steam, the shouting, the endless, grinding machinery of the war that waited just across the water. He tucked the notebook into his pocket, the paper damp now, the ink running slightly, the message incomplete, the truth unsaid. It would have to be enough. It would have to carry the weight of everything he could not say, everything he would never say, everything that died with him in the mud of France. He followed the line of men, marching towards the gangplank, towards the ship, towards the end of the story, leaving the unsent reply on the dresser in Woolwich, waiting for a postman who would never bring the answer. The gap in the narrative yawned wide. A white space where the truth should have been. A silence that would never be filled. Arthur cleared his throat, a dry rasp that competed with the coal settling in the grate. He held the paper at arm's length, the gaslight catching the rim of his spectacles, turning the lenses into opaque discs that hid his eyes from the room. Sarah did not look up from her darning. The wool was grey, pulled tight over the heel of a sock that had seen more miles than the boy who owned it, and her needles clicked a steady, metallic rhythm against the silence, marking time in a house where clocks had stopped mattering months ago. "Thomas says the frost is quite severe this year," Arthur read, his voice flattening the words, stripping them of the tremor that might have lived in the hand that wrote them. He writes that the jolly old elf has frozen the workshop stars to keep the machinery from overheating. Sarah nodded, a small jerk of her chin. A clever boy, she said, though her thumb rubbed a raw patch on the wool back and forth, wearing the fiber thinner. Always had a fancy for stories, our Thomas. He says the Lion King is quiet today. Good. Quiet enough to hear the bells, he reckons. Arthur lowered the letter. The paper crinkled, sharp and brittle, smelling of the hospital starch that clung to everything Thomas touched since the shrapnel took him down near Ypres, a scent of cleanliness that could not quite mask the underlying tang of old blood and carbolic acid which seemed to seep through the envelope itself. He folded the sheet along its existing creases, the lines white and worn, and placed it on the table beside the teapot. Steam rose from the spout, curling into the cold air of the parlor, vanishing before it reached the ceiling. Sarah set her knitting in her lap and reached for her cup. Her hand moved without thought, muscle memory, guiding fingers to the left of the saucer, where the blue cup with the chip on the rim always sat, the one Thomas had used before he enlisted, the one Elsie had washed only yesterday. Her fingers closed on empty air. She paused. The hand hovered, fingers slightly curled, grasping at nothing but the draft from the window sash. She blinked once slowly and shifted her hand 2 inches to the right, wrapping her fingers around the brown mug instead, the thick ceramic warm against her palm. No word was spoken. Arthur did not see the hesitation, or if he did, he filed it away in the same mental cabinet where he kept the notices of missing neighbors and the rising price of coal, things that were true but too heavy to lift. He sounds well, Arthur said, pouring tea into the brown mug, the liquid dark and tannic. The hospital air agrees with him. He sounds tired. They all are. Arthur took his own cup, the china clinking against the saucer, a small, fragile sound in the room. He looked at the bureau against the far wall, the dark wood gleaming in the firelight, the top drawer slightly ajar where the key had been left turning from the morning. Inside that drawer, bound in twine and sealed with wax that had long since cracked, lay the other letters. The ones that had come back with the black ink bars slashing through the sentences, the ones Elsie had brought home 2 weeks prior with yellow stains on her cuffs and a silence in her eyes that no story could fix, the unsent reply she had written to Thomas, and then tucked away when the postman failed to arrive, all of it tied with red string that looked too much like dried blood in the dim light. They did not speak of the drawer. To acknowledge it would be to admit that the lock existed, and to admit the lock existed would require a key, and turning the key would let the cold in, the real cold, the kind that no elf could freeze and no lion could roar away. Sarah lifted the mug to her lips. She blew on the surface, rippling the dark tea, watching the reflection of the fire break apart and reform. "Shall I read Elsie's?" she asked. Arthur shook his head. "Not tonight. She wrote on Tuesday. Tuesday's letter can wait for Thursday." He stood up, the joints in his knees popping, a dry sound like twigs snapping underfoot, and walked to the fireplace to poke the embers. The iron rod scraped against the grate, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney, bright orange stars that died the instant they touched the darkness of the flue. He watched them vanish. It was easier, he thought, to watch the sparks die than to wonder where they went. Easier to believe they simply ceased to be than to imagine them landing somewhere cold and unwanted. Sarah took a sip of tea. It tasted of iron and leaves, grounding her in the room, in the chair, in the year 1915, in the war that was happening everywhere except here, in this parlor in Bethnal Green where the cups vanished and the letters lied. She looked at the table. The sanitized letter lay flat, the ink blue and honest in its deception. She reached out and touched the edge of the paper. It felt no different than any other paper, no heavier, no warmer, yet it held the weight of a boy walking into mud and a girl filling shells with poison, holding it all suspended, so that she and Arthur could sit here and drink tea and pretend the world was not ending. Arthur straightened up, the poker still in his hand. The fire crackled, a sudden loud spit of resin that made them both flinch, just a twitch of the shoulder, a tightening of the jaw. On the wall behind the armchair, the shadow of the fireguard stretched long and distorted. For a second, the iron bars cast a shape that looked like antlers, a branching crown of shadow that rose above the chair back, trembling in the heat haze. Sarah saw it. Arthur saw it. Neither moved. The shadow held, a reindeer made of smoke and light, standing guard over the empty blue space on the table where the cup should have been. Then the coals shifted again. The antlers collapsed, folding back into the ordinary geometry of the grate, just iron and wood and brick. Arthur blew out the candle on the mantel. The room plunged into grey, lit only by the dying red eye of the fire. "Bed," he said. Sarah stood, leaving the brown mug on the table, beside the lie. She walked past the bureau, past the locked drawer, past the red string that waited in the dark, and followed her husband into the hallway, leaving the shadows to keep their own counsel. The hallway swallowed them whole, the darkness thick and cold against their faces, the air stale with the smell of damp coats and old wood that had soaked up the smoke of 1,000 winters. Arthur's hand found the banister, the wood smooth and worn under his palm, a familiar anchor in the blackness as he guided himself towards the stairs. Sarah followed, the hem of her skirt whispering against the floorboards, a soft, dry sound that seemed too loud in the quiet house. They did not speak. There was nothing left to say that the parlor had not already kept for them. Arthur's foot found the first step, the wood groaning under his weight, a low complaint that echoed up the well of the staircase and died in the shadows above. He paused, waiting for the house to settle, listening for the rattle of window panes or the distant thump of anti-aircraft guns across the river, but the night held still, the city holding its breath under the blackout curtains that turned every window into a blind eye. Sarah moved past him, her shoulder brushing his arm, the wool of her dress rough against his sleeve. "The cold," she said, her voice low, barely more than a breath. "It's December. It's deeper than that." She climbed the next step, her hand gripping the banister where his had just been, the warmth of his palm still lingering on the wood, fading fast in the draught that slipped through the sash windows. They reached the landing, the floorboards cold under their socks, the air thinner up here, closer to the roof where the tiles rattled when the wind picked up from the east. Arthur fumbled in his pocket, his fingers finding the box of matches, the cardboard striking surface rough against his thumb. He struck one, the flare of sulfur bright and sudden, casting sharp shadows against the wallpaper, the flame trembling in the draught before he cupped his hand around it. He lit the candle stub on the bedroom dresser, the wick catching with a small hiss, the light weak and yellow, struggling against the dark corners of the room. Sarah went to the window, checking the blackout cloth, her fingers tracing the edge of the tape where it met the frame, ensuring no sliver of light could escape to signal the Zeppelins circling overhead. "Secure?" Arthur asked. "Yes." She turned from the window, the candlelight catching the lines around her mouth, the grey in her hair that hadn't been there 2 years ago, before the war, before the letters started coming with the black ink bars. She sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress sinking under her weight, the springs creaking, a sound of ordinary life that felt strange after the silence of the parlor. Arthur blew out the match, the smoke curling up into the dark, smelling of burnt wood and chemicals. "He knew," Sarah said. "Who?" "Thomas, when he wrote it." Arthur unbuttoned his waistcoat, the buttons stiff, his fingers clumsy with fatigue. "They all know," he said. "That's why they write the lies. They're not lies. They're not the truth." He folded the waistcoat, placing it on the chair, the fabric heavy and dark, the smell of coal dust embedded in the weave. Sarah lay back on the bed, pulling the quilt up to her chin, the wool scratchy against her neck, the cold seeping in from the sheets that no amount of hot water bottles could fully banish. Arthur stood by the dresser, looking at the candle, the flame steady now, casting a circle of light that didn't reach the corners of the room. "The drawer," Sarah said. "I know. It's full. It is." He turned off the candle, plunging the room into darkness, the sudden absence of light making his eyes ache, the afterimage of the flame burning in his vision. He walked to the bed, the floorboards cold under his feet, and climbed in beside her, the mattress shifting as he settled, the warmth of his body slowly meeting hers in the space between them. They lay there, listening to the house, the settling of the timbers, the tick of the cooling stove downstairs, the distant rumble of a train moving through the night towards the front, towards France, towards the mud where the boys were walking. Sarah's hand found his in the dark, her fingers cold, gripping his with a strength that surprised him. "We keep the house," she said. "Yes. We keep the lights. Yes. And we wait." Arthur closed his eyes, the darkness behind his lids no different from the darkness in the room, the silence of the bedroom heavy with the weight of the unsent letters downstairs, the red string tied in a knot that neither of them dared to undo. Outside, the city slept under the blackout, the streets empty, the buses halted, the world held in suspension by the war that demanded everything and gave nothing back. A siren wailed in the distance, a low, mournful sound that rose and fell, signaling the all-clear or the alert. It didn't matter anymore, the sound just another part of the night, another thing to endure until morning. Sarah's breathing slowed, the rhythm of her sleep steady, her hand still holding his, the grip loosening as she drifted off. Arthur lay awake, listening to the wind outside, the sound of it rattling the window panes, the cold seeping through the glass, the war waiting in the dark for the sun to rise so it could begin again. He thought of the drawer, the red string, the letters tied up like parcels of meat, wrapped and sealed and stored away where they couldn't do any harm. He thought of Thomas, walking into the mud, and Elsie, filling the shells with poison, and the lies they told to keep the house standing. He closed his eyes. The house settled around them, the timber groaning, the bricks cooling, the silence deepening until it felt like a physical thing, a blanket wrapped around the family, protecting them from the truth that waited in the parlor, in the drawer, in the dark. Morning would come. The postman would knock. The kettle would boil. And they would do it all again, reading the lies, drinking the tea, pretending the cups hadn't vanished, pretending the children were still here, pretending the war hadn't already taken everything that mattered. Arthur slept. The candle smoke hung in the air, a thin grey ribbon that faded into the darkness, vanishing like the sparks up the chimney, like the boys in the mud, like the peace that never came. Downstairs, the drawer remained locked. The red string waited. The house held its breath. The Workshop of Frozen Stars is not a documentary record. It is a work of historical fiction, grounded in the real life and surviving wartime letters and records of John Simpson Kirkpatrick Man with the Donkey. The names, dates, places, campaigns, and outcomes are faithful to the historical record. The dialogue, the private scenes, and the inner life are imagined, dramatized, not documented. Where the story departs from the verifiable facts, the liberty is the author's own. The history behind it draws on these real sources. Santa Claus. The Chronicles of Narnia. Primary material researched via the Internet Archive. Context via Wikipedia.